have no idea where this will lead us, but I have a definite feeling it will be a place both wonderful and strange.
Hello, and welcome to the wonderful and strange Twin Peaks Logcast. I'm Kalil, and with me today is the disembodied head to my mystery corpse.
As the Unplugged Professor, I don't know whether this is better or worse. Is it better to be just the head left over, body unknown, or where the hell is my head? So, you know what? I'll let my head be here. At least I can be identified.
Thank you, Mr. Unplugged Professor. For those just tuning into our podcast, I am a veteran of the show. I have seen Twin Peaks seasons 1 and 2 and The Return before, only once for The Return, and the Unplugged Professor is joining me for the first time through all of these things. And how has that been going for you so far, these many, many, many months and years?
Many, many months and many, many years of all 2+ of them. I would say it's been a fantastic series of journeys. Mostly because we've covered multiple forms of media. We've went through the first and second season of Twin Peaks together. We've went through pieces of media that you haven't even experienced, such as Dale Cooper book, Dale Cooper tape, and probably other Dale.
Welcome to Twin Peaks Access Guide, the card art. There's a lot of like weird, on the fringe of whether or not people consider it canon material that I experienced with you the first time. And then I also got to show you the films of David Lynch.
Yes, and it was wild to say the least. Like, we were at Twin Peaks Logcast for just specifically David Lynch for, I think, over a year.
Well,
I think like half a catalog.
We mixed in some special features.
We mixed in some special features. It's just that it definitely was a new dish.
I know a lot of listeners have been very eagerly waiting for us to get to The Return. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
I hope that all of this pays off. My gamble has been that showing the professor, who's never seen all these things before, the David Lynch films, as well as these special features, and as well as the Twin Peaks books, all of that would kind of fuel a more enriching discussion of The Return than if we just went from season 2 to The Return right away. That's my hope, fingers crossed gamble. And if I'm wrong, I'm sorry that I wasted a year of your time.
The entire experiment is up to me now.
Now, when I first watched The Return, it was back when it aired originally back in 2017. And I will say just right off the gate, I had a very mixed feeling about The Return. I have not revisited it since, even though I've wanted to.
Yes.
And once we began our podcast, I figured, I'll just wait to rewatch it until we get there. And then 2.5 years or so went by, and now we're here. And I'm excited to be back. I'm excited to go into The Return. I will say, though, for any listeners coming in, if I ever have any sort of negativity toward it, it's not entirely negative. It is very much a mixed experience for me. I am someone who prefers the original Twin Peaks more than The Return. I enjoy Fire Walk With Me more than The Return, and I enjoy some of the David Lynch films and some of the books more than The Return. But I think The Return is one of the most challenging and interesting shows ever put on television, whether, network television like cable, or in this case, from Showtime. And I think it is so interesting to approach it from all these different angles that we generally are going to slide toward meticulousness. If you happen to notice, even if you're joining it for the first time, our episodes can get a bit longer. And the reason that they get that long is we take our time comparing it to all these things prior. So going forward, just to state this now, we are going to be giving spoilers for anything Twin Peaks related or David Lynch related prior to The Return. That means My Life, My Tapes, the Access Guide, Secret History, the card art. It also means we might talk about Inland Empire, might talk about Mulholland Drive. So if you are wanting to avoid any of those spoilers, wait for us, please. Wait 25 years if you have to.
Wait 25 years if you have to, or just do what we did and collect every piece of material. The Gazette will be on the test.
The Twin Peaks Gazette will be on the test. Also, a few notes for returning listeners. We aren't going to go through spoiler warnings or go through the who wrote and who directed situation. I mean, every episode's written by Mark Frost and David Lynch and directed by David Lynch. That's just the same for all of these 18 parts. And I'm not bringing in any sources for these episodes right now because we've got enough on our plate just directly appreciating them. And I really look forward to hearing the professor's first-time thoughts unaffected by external sources at this moment. Later, maybe.
Later, throw some external forces into my face and see if I come out alive.
Right now, we're just strapping him like into the chair, like in Clockwork Orange with the eyeballs eyelids peeled back.
Is there ever like an appealing sort of like form of Clockwork? I feel like Clockwork Orange is the major example of forcing someone to watch something.
It's generally an uncomfortable movie. I mean, like a more comfortable comparison. I'm trying to think of one that's like a positive forcing someone to get information.
There is none. This generally is just going to be an unappealing experience for me as you put me down, put my eyes open, and I'm just going to feed into the return. So let's get back to it, shall we? Let's strap me in, fling me into this chair, and let's look straight forward into what the hell I'm going to be looking at today.
So it sounds like you had a good time.
Oh,
with
absolutely.
The return.
It was wonderful.
Was it strange?
It was strange. It was wonderful. It was most certainly not what I was expecting, and I do genuinely vibe with that.
What were you expecting?
I was expecting... The thing is,
because you've told me before you didn't.
I immediately will place onto the table right now that I was not expecting many things, but still when sitting down, there's still a general like mindset, vibe, and feeling that I get when experiencing Twin Peaks in most forms in media. The only things that have really sort of like pushed that envelope is something such as the book of The Secret Diary of Laura Palmer, which tonally feels different. And admittedly, Fire Walk with Me feels tonally different, but it still sort of like leans you into it. This one is on a full-on stop. This is different. This is not the usual expectation you would have for Twin Peaks. There's not going to be much, I would say, area of aloofness. This show,
I think it's very aloof. I think the show is very aloof.
I think it's aloof in its own ways, but when it starts, it is very quiet.
You're going to hear me throughout this podcast refer to it as The Return, not as Season 3. This is where things get kind of confusing, and you just have to side wherever you side. Some people call this Season 3, and I get why. It is the third season in their mind. It just took 25 years to happen.
Yeah.
Some people view this as Twin Peaks, a limited series event. I just find that way too wordy.
Yeah.
And it gets confusing in my brain, but I will see it advertised and talked about that way. Or like just say Twin Peaks, parenthesis 2017. I get it. I think of this as a sequel to the original show and a sequel to Fire Walk with Me. And I view it as another installment of Twin Peaks. I believe it is Twin Peaks. But I do not think it's the same show that happened in the 90s. I think it's an entirely new continuation, the same way that the books were a new continuation, to the point where, I want to stress this, the original Twin Peaks was an amalgamation of many authors, many directors, many creatives. This is David Lynch's vision. This is clearly David Lynch's vision in a way where I would even say it's not made by the same people as the original show.
For the most part, we only have Lynch Frost inside here. Like a big lean on David Lynch because he has a lot of physicality to deal with it. I think visually, Twin Peaks comes off very striking, especially inside The Return. But at the end of the day, the biggest sort of like difference to hearken here is the fact that this is a different genre. Like, this is something in which, like, the original Twin Peaks, with The Invitation to Love as an example, it was a soap opera. A comedic soap opera, a fun soap opera, but it was a soap opera. This very much leans far more into a drama, almost into the heavy mindset of something such as a film. This does come off very much in David Lynch's film style.
It's an 18-hour movie.
And that was an overall credit to, say, for example, the shooting of the original Twin Peaks, because, like, a lot of movie qualities were put into there. I just think that for this one, it makes it very much clear, especially looking back into David Lynch's filmography as well.
Yeah, I made the joke it's an 18-hour movie. I don't view it that way, but I have heard people say that it's meant to be treated as an 18-hour movie.
And I think that the first episode makes that very clear. Admittedly, it almost, like, extra rubs it in to the point that it feels like a dead corpse sort of like floating in empty space, mostly because I think that the one thing that you and I were kind of going back and forth on when we were talking about it is that there's just barely any music, almost to the point that there's an active vacuum of music into the first part. It's one of the reasons in which, like, how dead the first part felt. And we saw onto the Blu-ray itself that these parts were combined and interlocked. They were just like, or at least I was just like, I want to see another episode. Like, I need to see where this is leading. I want to see if there's like a full reason behind the two-parter. And I'll admit, I think that whether it was David Lynch, Showtime, whoever's choice it was, I think it's right to pair these two together. I think it's right to have a full sort of like scope on like what may potentially come, because I don't think the first part fully satisfies that.
So as we continue, we might go back to doing one part per episode. We might find that doing 2 parts of The Return per podcast episode is better. Who knows about the future? It's uncharted territory. But I'm with you that for this podcast episode, it made sense to combine 1 and 2. There's a lot to say about both episodes, but tonally, they do something together that isn't quite there if you watch them separately. And not only were they shown together when it aired, but then again, the Z-Day collection defaults to showing you both of them at the same time. So there is something to be said for that. And also, while we're on the subject of the episodes in general, like the original show, they have dubious kind of titles. In the original Twin Peaks, there were episodes that received titles from the German airing of the show that then later people would kind of accept, even though they were never official in like the US or UK releases, for example. The Return has titles that are a bit more confirmed in the sense that when they originally aired on Showtime, there would be descriptions underneath part 1, for example, or part 2. It would give you a description of the episode. So, for example, part 1's description was, "My log has a message for you." And part 2's description would be, "The stars turn and a time presents itself." And the Z-Day collection uses those as like subtitles. So they're kind of the name of the episode, but also kind of not.
I think it's more likely that for me as a viewer, like not looking into the background of this, only like looking into the vacuum of the box set, like all the other parts of the Z-Day collection when we're looking back on Twin Peaks just show the episode number, no titles whatsoever. This is actually taking out the entire sort of like description, as you would call it, but at the end, what is a title more than just a description in and of itself? But regardless, like it has it presented there.
Yeah.
So inside of my personal vacuum, I do recognize these as titles in that respect, but I also respect the fact that this is a wild, potentially 18-hour experience of a full film, etc., etc.
So what did you think of the titles that were chosen then, if we want to go with that terminology? We have the first one called "My Log Has a Message for You," opening it up with the title from the log lady, and that being the kind of first impression. Do you like that as a title for part 1?
I think that it is something that's, 1, very recognizable, but 2, also very literally happens inside the episode. I think that the message for it also makes the first scene very suspect, if you will. I'll go deeper into it when we talk about the giant as well. Oh, I'm sorry, not the giant. Question mark, 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 as well as Cooper. I'll go into that a little bit deeper, but I think that that title makes that scene a little bit more suspect if we're entering that zone.
Yeah, because part 2 also has a Margaret Lanterman quote as the title, and that one is "The stars turn and time presents itself." So do you predict like that being a trend of like Margaret Lanterman titles?
I think it's going to be a trend with Margaret Lanterman, or at the very least references to Twin Peaks, and it just so happens that the log lady is an important part to all of it. But that's also a very fitting title for a later scene that ends up happening inside of it. I think that they actually makes things quite apt for it. I don't know if it was something that one was planned before the other, if you will, or if it just so happened to align, but at the very least, I very much like the very crypticness of it. I think tonally it very much works.
Returning to the music, that's definitely part of what makes this return feel so cryptic, I think, is that there's an eeriness to silence, especially when you remember the original Twin Peaks and know that used to always have music. It would have so much music.
It was always have music in the air, the birds, etc. The big quote that we end up getting. But the big part is that when you put in an absence of music, you take away, I would say, a coordinated vibe, if you will. A coordinated feeling that sort of like moves a momentum to the point that you don't necessarily have to listen to all the words. You more so feel out the moment. Inside this, you're focused almost hyper-fixatedly on the individual words, the speaking, to the point that there's almost a sort of like foreboding dread at multiple moments. And I would almost argue a sense of like, I've got to pay attention or elsewise I might pass out myself, or at the very least in the mindset that I was when I was first watching it.
So 3 things on that. One, with the music, Angelo Badalamenti is still the composer, and David Lynch is listed as sound design. So this is very much their wheelhouse again. David Lynch may be taking more of a role in sound than he did the first go-around.
Which is kind of funky because, like, David Lynch isn't too, like, shy of making sound. I mean, like, Fire Walk With Me is a big example of, say, for example, bits of soundtrack of his overall noise. So this is still a very unique case, but still, they almost, like, take a back seat.
Well, Inland Empire, the last David Lynch film, was also among the more quieter ones. And that one didn't have Angelo Badalamenti at all involved in it. And I think Mulholland Drive is generally quieter too. So it seems to be more of a direction David Lynch was going in his films as time went on. Anyway, Twin Peaks always had more music to it and more of a consistent presence of music than a lot of other David Lynch material. And now that we've removed that, it just furthers the feeling that this ain't your father's Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
I don't know. And the second thing I wanted to bring up also is that way back we first did the pilot many eons ago, and your first time viewing the very beginning of Twin Peaks, you described the feeling of Twin Peaks as visual ASMR.
Yes.
And part of that had a sound component for sure, but also visual ASMR. Do you feel like The Return, so far, is visual ASMR?
It's the intro that I believe that we introduced the idea of visual ASMR. And I think the visuals inside of the intro in The Return still do cut into that overall fabric. I think that the overall scope of like flinging yourself down off into the waterfall and also the spinning of the Red Room itself, if you will, amongst the chevron patterns and the curtains, the flinging almost like the fire-like nature of the curtains as you go left and right, which by the way, fabric is very important in that respect. Like those things, yes. For the duration of a lot of the episodes and a lot of the framing, or not a lot of the episodes, a lot of the moments in the episode, I would say that it feels cold. I think that it's less visual ASMR and more so a sensory deprivation room.
I would even go further than cold and say sterile. And this is where my complicated feelings on The Return come in a little bit, is that I don't think The Return has to be like the original. In fact, I'm kind of glad and respect the fact that David Lynch and Mark Frost didn't make this an obvious fan service beginning. It didn't try to bring everything back the way it was back 25 years ago. It fully acknowledges, and they fully acknowledged, this ain't the same thing, and we're not going to try to make it the same thing. On the other hand, I'd be lying if I said I prefer this. When I'm watching it and I'm experiencing that sort of cold, sterile atmosphere, yeah, part of me is thinking in the back of my mind, I do prefer being in Twin Peaks where there's the music and the color and the life and the energy. This doesn't have that. As an artistic statement, I'm like, wow, you guys did a good job making something different. On the other hand, I'm like, different ain't exactly better in this case. I still have my preferences for which one I like more.
Yeah, I think both fit in their own respective boxes well. It's just that it's not going to be coming out as, I would say, an overtly like happy-go-lucky, positive, put a smile on your face experience for this one. I think that this is one is going to, for the most part, really push your head in certain directions, and it's going to make it things very decisive, divisive, both to you.
Third thing, going back to a while back, third thing I have to say is you mentioned you were almost going to pass out watching this. Could you elaborate on that?
It is something in which it drags out its tone at times that without the aid of overall music or sound, and as I focus on those individual words and my own sort of like open yet sort of like whimsical mindset of just like letting information hit me, it still felt dead in the air. It felt like almost a silence in the air one would experience when lying in bed, if you will, as these events are happening. There's no drastic moment where something pushes and presses and happens. They uncover... There's not many. Instead of...
Non-existent! There's some moments.
That's in the part two.
That's
I'm
all
talking about part one.
Part
one is where you fall asleep. Part two, I think, is where things pick up.
Maybe the Sam and Tracy slice moment. The blood. That moment. That's in part one.
Yeah, at the very end.
That's fair. wakes you up again.
It does wake you up in the end, but everything before it,
sure.
It's like we're standing in front of a doorway having an active conversation of something that may have happened. We uncover a body and look down upon it. We're following a lady as well as her little dog Armstrong, just trying to desperately get inside of a door, but not desperately as in like we're frantically moving.
Right.
We're walking.
Oh, it's taking its time with the joke. We're slowly allowing the joke to linger that this lady is being this way, and then we find out the punchline at the end. Oh, she had the key.
But that's when, say, for example, punchlines when actively someone by the name of Mr. C punches a guy outside of the overall door. It makes those moments especially emphasized.
That is very true. Pacing is interesting with The Return. Even from the beginning with these first two parts, you can tell it is not paced the same way as the original show. The original show would have overlapping plot elements at the same time. Like you might have Cooper doing this with Harry Truman, and then it cuts to Audrey doing this, and then it cuts to Donna and James. This one's a bit different, though, in the sense, though, that you don't necessarily know how these even connect, and they're in totally different parts of the country.
Yes, as opposed to having something that feels like it's like naturally progressing upon some sort of like time frame in tangent. This feels like multiple spots in which you could put together different portions. The biggest example being like the moment of a glass box room in which like an event is happening in the background, but you only find out about that event in the past while another event is happening in the end of the second episode.
And it makes chronology really difficult to trace because you don't know going in if all these events are happening on a similar timeline. You have to interpret after the first two parts that they're not because of what you're saying over here. Mr. C doesn't go into the glass box, we find out, until part 2, even though that would have taken place in a scene in part 1, basically.
Not Mr. C, Cooper. Cooper's in the glass box, not Mr. C.
Did I say Mr. C?
You said Mr. C.
I meant Dale.
I know, they're commonly mistaken. They look a lot alike.
It's really quite impressive. But what I'm getting at, though, is that we already have evidence of this. And like one other one that came to my mind is that the things going on with even just Deputy Hawk, right? And Andy and Lucy, you can infer likelihoods of how much time is passing based on whether it's night, morning, or daytime in the shots. But it gets to be really confusing the more you look at it because it seems to be a case where he'll receive a call at night from Margaret Lanterman who will tell him about something. Then it looks like the next morning he tells Andy and Lucy that tomorrow you should do something, but then it goes to night and you're like, wait, is this the same night as the second day, or are we on the third day now? Where are we? And then, like, Lucy talking to that guy who was looking for Sheriff Truman. Which day did that land on? So already this is like, what is happening? And I've made comments at the podcast. Time is weird in Twin Peaks. Never like this.
This is very much running off of Black Lodge / Red Room timeline.
Because even just from the beginning, you don't know whether things are happening concurrently or completely separately. We don't even know, for example, the stuff in South Dakota with Buckhorn. We know that it has to parallel some things with Mr. C because he references those things. But those two timelines could be a week ahead of what's happening in Twin Peaks, for all we know. Could be a week behind what's happening in Las Vegas, for all we know. So it's kind of weird and kind of wonky. And also noticing that this was made for Showtime, they didn't have to put in ad breaks. So you can feel that scenes were allowed to go way longer. And whether you find that effective or not, we'll have to assess as we go on, Professor. But it allows for scenes that normally would have had to cut for commercial to just continue.
And
continue.
They do continue.
And I think it's mixed for me. Just giving examples from these first two parts, I think that the continuing of the box works. I like how much time is spent staring at this box. It gives you a sense of what is happening, that Sam literally is being paid to do this for hours, presumably. Where I don't think it works is the running gag with Ruth's apartment.
I think that having it, again, with that evocative silence is the main difference, because when you're caught in silence, you're paying attention to things a lot more, and you're just sort of like looking around and just keeping mind to things. For Ruth's apartment, the neighbor would not stop talking. It feels like a natural moment you'd see with Twin Peaks. It's just like with the absence of music, sure, it's a little bit off, but for the most part, it's still the usual sort of like banter. It's like, oh yeah, I thought of this, I thought of this, I thought of this. Oh well, we're gonna walk over here. Oh wait, I actually had this whole time. We're gonna walk right back over here. And then there's a mysterious little, oh yes, I got a crime scene. Oh no, you can't be a part of this. And it's wild, it's frantic, but it's still like weirdly stretched. Like it, like those are going to still be fun moments, but they still have a pacing to them.
It feels like a joke you'd make with Lucy back in season 1 and season 2, but it's drawn out so much more and so much quieter and, in my opinion, less effective because of no music.
Yeah.
And like I just said in the most recent episode of our podcast, my favorite thing about Twin Peaks is the characters. And this is where I want to pose a question to you.
Yeah.
You meet a lot of new characters in the original Twin Peaks pilot, and you meet a lot of new characters in parts 1 and 2 of The Return.
Yes.
What did you think of the new characters of Twin Peaks?
They most certainly match the vibe that I was giving off, and that is mostly dead air. Some of them have dialogue that I would say is fairly reminiscent of a Twin Peaks style, but without that air and atmosphere, not as much sticks around. I mean, like, I can see that sort of like quirky, weird, awkward behavior from Sam that I could parallel with someone like James, if you will, but it comes off very absent without that sort of like atmosphere buildup. You're caught within this vacuum of space for the most part that unfortunately the actions that happen to the characters become more important than I would say the presence of the characters themselves.
I would agree with that very much. To me, a lot of the characters feel like they're set pieces, they're props, they're things to advance a mood or to advance information, but they don't feel as much the main attraction as they did in the original show, at least for me, with one exception, who is maybe a new character depending on how you think of things. Mr. C. Love Mr. C.
Oh, okay. That could have went two separate different directions. I thought it would be an evolution of a direction, if you will.
I do love the evolution of the arm, but I think Mr. C is so clearly the standout character in parts 1 and parts 2.
Yes, I think that he's the standout character, especially since this is a separate entity, I would say. At the very least, a changed entity in the past 25 years that we're not used to. There's various characters that I would say I somewhat recognize them, but Mr. C is so cold, calculated, and focused that not only is he just a fun threat, but I would also argue that he's the most realized new character.
It's kind of a weird thing, and I'm not sure if I'm able to articulate it very well, but even the characters who are returning, it feels like they're on a mission from the very beginning. They're not given a lot of time to show personality. Like, Lucy's there to respond to a question at the counter.
She's
Hawk
doing her
is there
job
to receive a message from Margaret, and they just kind of are on their track. And even Dale Cooper, we get him so early on, he's just kind of there to listen to the giant or question mark, 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 or listen to the evolution of the arm, or listen to Philip Gerard, Mike. He's there to receive and then kind of like respond in brief snippets. Does he still feel like Dale Cooper?
Does he? Like, that's the thing. Like, it's in the atmosphere of the Red Room. It's less of, like, does this feel like Dale Cooper more than does this feel like the Red Room? And I think that the latter is the more stronger
Because Cooper
point.
wasn't fully, quote-unquote, himself in the parts where he was in the Return in the in the Red Room in the original.
Kinda. The biggest argument that I have to say is that, like, there's still the weird scene at the end of Fire Walk with Me where, like, Cooper is more emotive than usual, but still, like, smiling at Laura Palmer's died.
Sure.
And then, like, Laura Palmer being present later on. Is this future? Is this past? I don't know. Who is this guy?
So the show opens up, the return opens up with the scene of Dale Cooper and Laura Palmer together way back that was shot during the pilot and used during episode 2, which is the third episode of the original show, which is that shot of I'll see you again in 25 years.
Yes, it's something that has been like beautifully sort of like remastered. I remember making a comment at first like, wait a second, like they look like they haven't changed too much, but that's just because they were able to take the footage and bring it up to the point that it looked like basic modern standards with like no dilution.
Restoration's
like,
incredible.
It's very stunning, especially like compared to like the DVDs you showed me once before. I think that you and I saw scenes like this on the DVDs before I got the ZDA collection, but by the gods, the quality is just really good. It matches up with the standard, and I think that that's actually very rare to say, which means that if they ever reuse scenes inside the future, like there's almost like, I suppose maybe like an unfair expectation from me being like, okay, you can actually do this. I'm excited to see how you can use this later on as well.
You know, when you start with the 25 years later scene, I think the most obvious thing and the most obvious reason why you would do it is to establish right off the gate the acknowledgement that this new continuation of Twin Peaks, whether you call it The Return or Season 3, that it is 25 years later. It sets up that idea that time has passed. It sets up that theme, and then it leads directly into the shortly afterward, I think it's in part 2, Dale Cooper with Laura Palmer interaction. So I could see it being used there. I do, however, want to bat around the idea of, considering so much of this feels fine-tuned and very purposeful from David Lynch, and maybe Mark Frost as well, do you think there's any other additional reason why it would start, before we even get to any other content, with this interaction with Dale Cooper and Laura? What is it setting up?
It's setting up a sense of recognition as well as, I would say, almost like a promise of mystery. Not necessarily like there's a pointed mystery, but it's using the previous material in a way that tries to connect the overall weirdness that is the Red Room in Twin Peaks, especially with the motion of meanwhile and the pose. Like we saw before with the snap downwards, that's been recontextualized through something such as Fire Walk With Me. Anyone who's followed with this work up to this point might hyperfixate, like me, on that pose and position and see where this goes. It's the promise of the past as we lead into the future, not in the sense that it's going to be reused in a fashion that is familiar, but more so, there is an identity to that past.
It also reasserts the importance right away of Dale Cooper and Laura Palmer. And I mean, it's probably not very surprising that Dale Cooper would be very much in The Return, given how much of a presence he is by the end of The Secret History of Twin Peaks. And given, again, he's like the face of Twin Peaks.
Yes.
But Laura is an interesting one because presumably her main mystery was solved 25 years ago. And that's the question I think you'd have to linger with is what role would Laura Palmer play in The Return if this is presumably the story, at least in part, of Dale Cooper returning to Twin Peaks, right? What does Laura have to do with this? Where is Laura going to figure? Do you have any predictions or thoughts based on either the opening or what we saw of the Laura Palmer in the Red Room later? What role do you see Laura playing in The Return now that we already killed the Golden Goose 25 years ago? Now that we know who killed her, does she still matter?
I think she matters, but mostly in the respect of an entity of the past. I think that it's going to be playing with future and past plenty, especially with the overall quotes that we're bringing up at this time. But also, her mother was a seer figure. Like, there's a mystical nature to Laura Palmer in general. I think that she is going to be a presence inside the Red Room alongside with Philip Gerard, or Mike, however you want to.
I'm going to kind of probably bounce between the two different because we don't know at this point.
They're going to be the most present entities inside of the Red Room that are probably going to carry dialogue as well as mystique, alongside with different stylings of, say, for example, the Giant as well as the evolutionary arm, mostly because it sounds like the arm is going to be less so present, in which I would imagine he would take the lead on into it. So, Kalil, you got anything to say about that?
I want to make a note that when we say Philip Gerard versus Mike, what we should do next time is if we see this character appear in the future, we should check the credits, what they list this character as, because the credits seem especially important this time around in a way that they might not have been in the original running of the show, because there is information in these credits you don't quite get elsewhere. For example, we made the common reference at this point that it may not be the Giant, it might be ? 7 times, because that is how the character is listed in the credits.
However, say, for example, when Dale Cooper questions if, like, Laura Palmer is present inside of the Red Room, and she sort of, like, kind of dodges the question, moves around it. Inside the credits, she's credited as Laura Palmer. Now, mind you, in the opening credits, like, there is a picture of Laura Palmer, but at the same time, like, there's not a secondary credit or anything like that for Cheryl Lee.
So it's like, how much stock do you put in the credits? That's a really fun new challenge for us going through this. And even just the idea of the evolution of the arm. Is that the same character as the arm? How important is the evolution aspect? Is it like a Pokemon? is that an evolution? Like, is it even the same person? I think is a challenge. It's the Ship of Theseus metamorphosis.
Is anything the same 25 years later? Like,
right.
There's plenty.
These are the kind
of
questions that are going to play with as we're watching, and they may even be intentional questions. So I'm going to probably just say the Giant to save myself from having to say ? 7 times every single time.
Question mark man.
But we'll say the Giant, with a black and white grayscale scene with Agent Cooper. First thing after the credits and after that opening.
Which, by the way, this whole entire scene, completely black and white. And yet again, I think that the material used in the background is very, very, if not important, most certainly it is very nice for the overall visual appeal of the area. Like, they seem to be curtains, if you will. Like, anyone could reuse curtains. They probably have plenty on set, if you will. But it's very striking to see, like, the look of the shading with the black and white of the curtains almost make a very jagged look and appeal. It almost looks very wood-like, if you will. It looks like a textured grain.
Even the gramophone, it doesn't look like a brass, gramophone element. It looks like it's almost rubbery to me. So there is something to with the way that either the materials were made or the grayscaling was done that feels very purposeful to create a sort of, it's something you're familiar with, but also not quite. Why do you think this was in black and white?
It was in black and white, I think, for one, to sort of like obscure details, but also highlight them. I think that the visual appeal of this scene is very important, that within color, it may look nice, but it's not going to invite the eye as much. I think that having the stark contrast is very nice. But also, when you think black and white, what do you think?
I think of old, 40s and 50s.
You think of old. You think of something of past. Is it present? Is it
Yes.
future? Or is it past? I think this is going to play. I'm going to say this so many times in
Right.
this podcast. Do not take shots. Please do not.
Well, and also, if we're thinking of the black and white lodges, grayscale is in between.
Yes.
It is someplace caught between good and bad, evil and good, but also caught between past and future is what I would think.
It's a past. It's a record. I think that it makes this place look very different. And if you want me to show my hand a little bit sooner, the fact that
Reveal the hand.
this room does not feel like it has any sharp corners, if you will. The overall curtains themselves have a very textured grain in it. This mystical entity is known for having many question marks, if you will, a very larger-than-life individual. And Cooper seems to be an overall visitor, but seems to be traveling through some sort of electric waves as he disappears at the end of this. This is a very strange spot that is different from any spot we've seen before.
It may not be Red Room.
I think I know where it is, but I think I'm guessing way too soon.
Say it.
I think this is inside the log.
The log.
It's a room that feels round outright. Looks like it has a wooded style texture, has a mystical voice inside. And if we had to think of like thoughts sort of like traveling through in a sense of electricity in this mystical nature, that might be a potential way in which this is able to communicate. I think that the log communicating outwards and being on the same page, and the fact that Cooper is having conversations with the entity on the inside, I think the entity inside of here, if not just an acting entity within the log, could be considered the log, if you will. Something that is making sure to sort of like move these pieces along, especially since it seems like everything's interacting with one another to get Hawk on the same page with the log to be met with this overall location. I think this is very guiding. I think especially since on the gramophone, that strange scratching sound, I think is something reminiscent of scratching upon wood, if you will. Something that's very like catches on to something, almost like carving, if you will, small bits of scratching. Not to mention, like, I know maybe it's not a one-to-one sort of like physicality, but a man who may appear overall bigger than life, if you will. Who knows? Maybe they're like, this is the biggest stretch of all. But how much of the physical appearance have we really dived into? Margaret's? Catherine? What was the name of the log lady? Margaret's husband.
Sam Lannerman.
Maybe there could be a lean into that, of that overall entity still lingering, this overall caring figure that is looking out for other individuals.
I mean, we do get descriptions, I believe, in The Secret History of Twin Peaks that would suggest that Sam Lannerman was a very tall individual.
Yeah.
He was known for being very tall. That is an interesting connection. And of course, because I have seen The Return one time before, I cannot spoil whether you are close or far away or somehow in between.
I love the fact that this probably is going to be the most tortuous 17 to
I mean, not telling you who
8
killed Laura
parts.
Palmer also was pretty torturous.
It was pretty torturous, but
Because this so far doesn't have a guiding question the way that the original show had Who Killed Laura Palmer.
Yeah.
2 parts in, this one doesn't have one mystery. Would you agree with that?
I agree.
So I do have a difficult job in that regard, and I think the podcast is at its best when you fling out your wild ideas, and if they turn out to be really correct or really wrong, I think they're going to be very entertaining for the audience, and for myself, admittedly, too. So I think that's a very interesting theory that you have brought forward here. Noticing also when we're having these conversation elements that Cooper does not talk backwards like the other characters are doing. The subtitles refer to it, I think, as like distorted or reverberating speech, not backwards speech like they maybe could have worded it. So noticing that everyone else does kind of solidifies that this Cooper is not part of the lodge, right?
No.
The giant says, "It is in our house now." How do you take that to mean?
It's something that whatever this entity is, whatever this forebodingness is, I do think that it's a potential threat, especially whenever like there's a pointed it to be recognized.
So you think it's a threat that's found its way into their house?
I think that is something that has crept in that could be posed as a threat.
It's a termite in the log.
It's a termite in the log, yes.
To go with your theories.
Literally a giant bug
That'd be
descends
terrifying.
in the background.
I'd be scared.
No, I think that it's something that could pose a threat. It's not necessarily a threat at this time, but it could pose a threat. Something is creeping in, if you will. There are things that are closing in on this point. It makes the moments that follow all the more important. So recognizing that something's coming in, though not identifying it entirely, is just something to add tension.
Could you read it positively and say, like, it is in our house now means, like, we have got it, like, it's in our hands now? Like, this is a good thing?
Yeah, I think that still is an amount of tension. Like, even if it's inside your house, you gotta make sure to get to it before it goes away.
Okay.
It's just that in that case, it's reversed on to, say, for example, the acting role of Question Mark Man and
Like,
Cooper
basically,
to act.
it's like, it's our turn, or, like, the ball's in our court. Maybe, like, that's the best comparison?
No, I think that both could work out well. It's still nonetheless a threat to the moment.
Okay, fair enough. And also, the giant says it cannot all be said out loud now. So, do you think that, like, someone's listening in that they can't say it? Or, like, they don't know what's going to happen yet, so they can't predict it? Like, why do you think they can't say it all out loud right now?
I think that they can't say it all out loud right now. I think, for one, it sets up a tone for the sake of, like, not everything will be spelled out and spoken out.
I think it's meta for the audience.
I think it is very much meta for the audience. But also in a secondary sense, I think that it's trying to guide Cooper emotionally, making sure that the analytical side of the situation isn't heavily relied upon. It's saying that, like, there's just some things that we won't be able to speak plainly about.
Right. So that,
Buckle
again, is
up,
telling
basically.
it's telling us that us doing this podcast is a faulty effort.
No,
because
it's not faulty effort. It's just that some things cannot be handled
Yeah.
like that. It doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile to make the attempts.
And then obviously the most cryptic of all, remember 430 or 430, and then Richard and Linda, followed by two birds with one stone. And it's not clear if two birds with one stone are the two birds Richard and Linda, are the two birds 430 is one bird, Richard and Linda's a second bird, or is it completely unrelated because there's enough of a pause in between where the two birds with one stone is like a third item separately? What do you do with any of this? As like a new person,
You collect it in your box. You collect it in your box, you write down the numbers, and then you look meticulously around for a Richard and or Linda.
I know what you're thinking.
Or Richard Linda.
We do know a Richard. Dick Tremaine. Richard Tremaine. Could we
look for some other Richard?
Could it in
Any
fact
other
be?
Richard? Can we get a new Richard in here?
Why not? What do you have against this dashing man?
I think that
This connoisseur of culture.
if there was ever a person that seemed like important for a time to be shoved into the hole in the middle of Twin Peaks, at the very least by the end, I think Richard Tremaine would have accidentally stumbled in, tripped over his own scarf.
We
and
do see that
fleeing.
Lucy sided with Andy in the end, that we see her name as Lucy Brennan, right, on the placard, on the name card. And we also know that, like, she talks about their son, their child together. So it does seem like whatever the DNA test, if they even did a test, showed that she's chosen Andy, or that Andy was found out to be the one either way. We haven't heard anything about Dick.
Nope.
And
We haven't heard Dick about Dick.
Do you expect to see Dick Tremaine? Because clearly in the nudity in this show, we did not see any male genitalia, so I'm not referring to that way.
How dare. Now, yes and no. I think Dick Tremaine could reappear in some fashion.
I will say I hope he does.
But I don't know if it's going to be physically.
I've already watched the show, but I'm just going to say I hope he appears.
You hope he appears. Good for you.
Cooper, in response to the 430, Richard and Linda, and then two birds with one stone, Cooper replies, I understand. Okay. What? So he understands what's going on, right? Is that your takeaway? Like, he does know what those things mean?
It's basically, he doesn't move that much inside the Red Room. If there's one thing that we knew about Twin Peaks, Cooper gives thumbs ups a lot.
Yeah.
That's just a verbal thumbs up.
So then it comes to the idea, of course, is it future, is it past? Does this black and white scene take place before the other scenes we see with Cooper or not?
I don't believe so, personally.
You think it happens after?
I think it happens post Cooper falling into the water. I think that when he's flying through the overall stars and cosmos inside of part 2, he's going to be going all over the damn place, even more so than usual. I think that that's literally an opening into whatever spacious void the metaphors of the lodge would press.
So whether it came before, after, concurrently, whatever, the next time that we see Dale Cooper is that he is sitting in the familiar Red Room environment, and next to him appears Philip Gerard or Mike.
He's present there, and he's leaning in, and I gotta say, I was expecting the arm to be there, because, forgive me, but whenever I think of the Red Room, I think of, like, the first person that I'd expect to have a conversation with Cooper would be the arm, because, hey, for one, we have the incidents with the overall ring in Fire Walk With Me. We have the first scenes in which sitting down with, say, for example, Laura Palmer, that there will be the arm. But no, Mike's not one that's very commonly in the Red Room. Mike's usually the weird one in the Red Room. And yet Mike is the one that we're first presented with as a good human face for Cooper to talk to. That's funky. What's up with the arm? Like, where's the arm?
You know, in 25 years, a lot can change than a business structure. I think the arm moved to a new branch, one could say. And it's interesting because the lodge spirits, at least if we're going by this, they age.
Yes.
Because, I mean, I don't know how they were going to avoid that unless they recast or did CG, but Philip Gerard / Mike ages, and then Laura and Leland when we see them in their age. And the arm also transforms over time. So there's this sense in which time has passed for them. Philip Gerard / Mike is probably one of the oddest encounters we've had from the Red Room so far, because it's really hard to pinpoint whose side this person's on, if anyone.
I mean, literally, he's lost his arm and he's connected to the arm in some fashion, so it makes sense for him to stand in. Clearly, I believe that, is there any information you want to give the audience over the actor, potentially, that there might be a conflict of interest of, say, for example, bringing in the original arm?
You want me to actually answer this question?
I want you to actually answer this question, because I do think that it's a good lead-in to probably why we're here and why certain decisions had to be made.
So my understanding of the situation is that there was a period in the 2000s, maybe early 2010s, I'm not sure, where the actor who played the man from another place, also known as the Arm, named Michael J. Anderson, that actor had made accusations against David Lynch, that David Lynch had killed his friend and actor Jack Nance, who we know as playing Pete Martell, as well as numerous roles, big and small, within David Lynch's films. Now, the idea that David Lynch would kill Jack Nance, on the face of it, is one, a very serious, horrible accusation. On the other hand, I would need a lot of proof to be convinced of that, personally. David Lynch did not seem to take kindly to that accusation.
No. And
when the return happened, there weren't that many recasts we've seen so far. Most of the returning people have been the same actors.
Yeah.
The Arm seems to have been recast.
Arm seems to have been recast and is put into a different position, hence why I think right now we're seeing Philip Gerard instead.
Now, if Michael J. Anderson hadn't made those comments and accusations, would we have seen him in The Return instead of seeing The Tree? I think yes.
But
I don't know if we ever would know. I don't know if this was planned beforehand. To me, it reads very comically as David Lynch going, you say that about me? Well, look what I'm going to do to your character. Like, I just see it as like one of the funniest ways to respond to a situation. Clearly, you're not going to bring this guy back for your show, but you need this character to be in there. Why don't you just make him a tree? I find it to be...
A tree with saran wrap bubble head and tiny little mouth. Yeah.
But before we get
there...
We first get the Mike scene where he says, is it future or is it past? And given that he says it so dramatically, given that it's one of the first big lines uttered to us in color,
yes,
and given that we get it again later, shortly after this next scene, it seems important. So throughout this podcast history, I've occasionally dropped lines of is it future, is it past? I've also dropped lines of Laura being dead yet she lives, because those are little nuggets I've sprinkled throughout the podcast. You wouldn't have known that they were going to come up.
Why would I?
Why would you? So there is this sort of idea, and then Mike says someone is here before he clips out. Now, the most likely interpretation is that the someone who is there is the one we next see walk into the room, which is Laura Palmer if we go by the credits. Even though that is questioned by Dale Cooper.
Sometimes my hands go backwards.
I do want to entertain the idea that if we said it's in our house now, the someone is here could be that termite or other threatening presence if there is one. So it doesn't necessarily, again, mean that it is Laura. It's just circumstantially, sequentially, that makes the most sense. Either way, Mike dips out, and we get Laura walking in, and she asks, do you recognize me? And he's like, are you Laura Palmer? He's just kind of checking his grounds here. And she does, again, like the familiar, I feel like I know her, my arms bend back. And she does eventually say she's Laura Palmer. And then we get that, but Laura Palmer is dead. I am dead, yet I live. What do you take to be Laura's state of being right now? Is this a ghost? Is this a doppelganger? What is this we're seeing?
It's not a doppelganger because the eyes aren't different. I do think that generally it's going to continue a visual trend for doppelgangers. Maybe the eyes aren't going to be the telltale sign, but I do think that there are going to be very notable differences between an entity as well as its doppelganger. The entities, however, is it a form of just a present memory or an overall thought of someone, a la the spirit living on, like Coco? Or is it...
Because that's another thought I had too, is it just in Cooper's head?
Yeah.
Like, is it, how do we know in the Red Room what's real, quote unquote, and what's just in Cooper's mind?
In Cooper's head or in public consciousness, sort of like a thought or an idea, because like these other individuals could be physical entities representing other ideas, or they could be other people from different points of the past, like
I think
very suspicious things.
I think it really matters though, because when we're getting to Laura and Leland, if this is the afterlife, right?
Yes.
If this is literally their same souls, that has implications that when Laura died, she went to the same place that Leland is, although they are separate by different rooms, and they both age at their normal rate they would have in human life. That has implications for like the spirits of Twin Peaks, if it is in fact the same soul as the real human Laura Palmer. I'm leaning currently toward, if I were again watching this the first time, I would lean currently toward the idea that it's probably the public consciousness or Cooper's idea of Laura aging, because it really is hard to take into my consideration that Laura saw the angel in fire walk with me and then spent the next 25 years in purgatory.
No, I think it's very compelling to say that the what could have beens could be very present here.
We'd like to believe Laura's at peace, wouldn't we?
We do. But still, the dialogue itself, as well as the strange backwards speech, as well as Cooper being the only one present with forward speech, if you will, makes Cooper the most, I would say, grounded thing inside of this place, and everything else up to insane amounts of suspicion. Especially, I'm sure I'm going to bring him back inside of the future, more backwards talk Windham Earl time.
Right. It is just interesting because I normally don't encounter mythos or any works where people age like that in the afterlife after they're dead, because that means the spirits just keep aging. What happens when they get to like 150? They just keep getting older looking?
Maybe it fluctuates.
Maybe they turn into a tree.
Maybe they turn into a tree.
That's what we all evolve into, right?
Yep, a tree with electricity and saran wrap and last week's dinner wrapped inside of it, whatever that became.
Laura also removes her face and blinding white light emits.
And she pulls out a Coca-Cola from the overall face, closes it, drinks it, the logo pops up. It was a weird advertisement. No, there's a coldness inside of the overall face that I thought of a freezer, but I don't think that that's wrong to feel just because of that cold light from the beyond. I think that's showing off that she's dead in this cold night light from what is the central figure of a mind, of a presence, of a being, of the recognizable force of the face, I think is most certainly a statement that she is trying to actively make of like, I'm dead, still here, but I am dead.
So I was just going to ask you, what do you think it means? Because does it mean that she is like a symbol of love and light and hope?
No, there's no love inside there. There's just light. I think there's a difference, I think.
So you do read it as a negative.
It deals with a neutral force of the universe more than a negative. It is something that is just a cosmic truth of death.
Okay. It's like a blank slate. tabula rasa kind of situation, or what?
I would say so. It's something that is blinding. It's something far beyond. It's something you can't see beyond, but it is still presently there.
Go toward the light sort of idea. I do like how Dale Cooper sees that and then is just like, can I go? Like, when can I leave right now, please?
Would you, if someone removed their face to reveal
He's
their
seen a lot of things
freezer
in
head,
25 years, probably.
like I too would say, I would like to leave now. Thank you very much.
And we don't know how much time has passed for Cooper. We don't know if it's felt like 25 years or if it's felt like a day. Who's to say how long he's really felt this has been? Cooper doesn't react very strongly to a lot of things while any of this is happening.
If you can.
Yeah, if you even can. He gives very muted responses, again, similar to how we saw him at the end of season 2 in the lodge, or in the Red Room, whatever you want to consider this. Laura walks over like she did in the previous iteration in 25 years ago, gives a kiss, although it feels like a longer, bigger kiss than maybe what was given before, and whispers something into Cooper's ear. However, Cooper responds with like a, huh? And then just kind of has an expression. And how would you read the emotion of Cooper upon hearing the whispered thing?
Well, first off, I would like to say that the kiss, as opposed towards something that seemed potentially passionate inside the original, seems very brief and lacking, if you will. It
feels passionless, yeah.
Passionless.
I don't think it felt brief. I thought it actually felt longer because it felt awkward. To me, the time stretched. I did not get a stopwatch out and time the kisses.
It doesn't seem like there's a full macking going on here. It seems like there's a perceivable lack of mac.
The romance is dead. Which, I mean, again, if we're looking at metaphors or meta elements, the romance of the investigation, the romance of Laura Palmer is dead. All you're left with is this passionless kiss. The romance is dead. I think there's something to that, you could argue.
And with the overall sort of like whisper in, I wasn't looking directly as much for the response, mostly because the beginning was distracting, and this portion, for its overall silence, feels rather brief, if you will. This is a very brief, if not a goodbye, a sort of like brief instance in overall Cooper's journey before he must move on.
It's really hard to read the expression, I think. I think that it is definitely a change in expression. He doesn't stay neutral during it.
No.
But it seems like startled at first, the way he does the huh. To me, I read as startled, maybe a bit surprised. And then he kind of like fits into that realization. But I don't know if I would read it as fearful or wary, while at the same time, it's definitely not positive.
No.
I don't get a glimmer of smile or light from it. It seems like something that's like really shocking at first, and then trying to wrap your mind around it is I guess the best I could graph onto it. How I'm interpreting his silent reaction to it. All we get is that huh, but I don't know. I don't read positive out of the feeling of it.
No, not many positives we can bring out of the Red Room.
Speaking of not positive, Laura steps back, starts freaking out, and then flies upward, screaming and whooshing toward the viewer.
Laura just had someplace to go, I guess. Well, it's like the camera shakes.
Yeah.
It intensely like flings her about, and there's another like shaky camera instance into the future, but still, regardless, she's just like flung outside, almost like a fish on a reel, and just flies away.
Why?
Good
Why do you
question.
think she was in? Because she seemed like genuinely not well when that happened.
It feels like she was forced away, if you will, whether or not it is something of reliving the instance of death, if you will, as overall time is just generally wonky, or that could be a thing. It could be something which, like, she is brought in as a notable entity, if you will, potentially into a glass box of some variety, if you will, and changes form because there's boobies on the overall entity. I'm
going at the implications, not the at the boobies, just to clarify. I'm interested in your line of reasoning.
But regardless, it does not seem like this is her intention. It seems like something is acting against her before she is whisked away.
Okay. Interesting. I love the curtain effects that occur shortly after this. We see the white horse similar to the one that was maybe seen by Sarah Palmer a long time ago?
Yeah, I think it's notable that it's off to the side, if you will, as the curtains part, rather than being the attention that it seeks through. It's almost as if, like, the white horse being potentially death, being off to the side, off into the corner, still ever present, watching over what's happening, almost like evoking a means of threat.
I don't know. For whatever reason, the way it zooms through, like, the digitally created floor pattern, it reminds me of, like, a Windows screensaver. Like a computer screensaver. Like, I could just imagine, like, you have it set so it just zooms across the floor with, like, various Twin Peaks elements popping in now and then from the shadows.
I think it reminds me more around that area of, like, using, like, live action with a point-and-click adventure, if you will. Okay. You just refuse to click the horse and you continue the plot.
I'm just thinking it's an area that keeps looping until you click the horse, but you're just stubborn at this point.
No, I'm just
You're
stubborn.
just going to keep going forward.
I want to see if the game tells me anything else, or if I've just, like, made, like, an infinite loop that developers didn't want me to do. Oh, every time I do that.
And then right after this scene, we get again a repeat of Mike asking, "Is this future? Is this past?" Which then, of course, leads you to wonder naturally, most likely, is the scene with Laura and Cooper that we just saw future or past? Where in the timeline or one of the timelines is this in Twin Peaks? Do you have any current ideas of, like, chronologically when Cooper talked to Laura that this would be even brought up? Why emphasize this scene being future or past?
I think that's emphasizing it because at this point, I don't know how Cooper perceives time, but we saw in Fire Walk With Me how time is already funky, how, like, Cooper is speaking directly to Laura at a point. I think that it's just sitting down with Cooper and not only emphasizing for the audience who might be new to the return, not seeing the prior material, but also emphasizing to Cooper the importance of recognizing the lack of overall time linearity within the Red Room. It's far more of a liquid more than it is a solid.
So you don't think it's specific to the scene with Laura, more just trying to reinforce the idea?
Yes.
Okay. Well, we'll have to see as time goes on if which one seems to be more likely. Yes.
Is it likely or is it not?
So we've teased it. We've winked at it. We've nudged it. Let's talk about this tree.
It's something that looks barren, if you will, very thin, similar to what was emphasized as the sycamore trees that are wrapped around the overall pond?
The Glastonbury Grove.
Ooze. Yeah.
Well, and then we also had in the season 2 finale the singing, right?
Yes.
Of "I'll see you through the trees."
Yep. I didn't realize it would be because they are trees.
They're literally trees.
But literally, like, there's, like, this small, like, the most notable part of it is, for one, amongst this tree, there's flashes of light, almost like electricity running through it.
And the subtitles will call it electricity crackling.
And a saran wrap beehive where the insides of it is an unknown overall liquid that's for some reason isn't being poured out of this overall weird sort of, like, fleshy mouth.
That is such like interesting. I've seen people say it looks like gum, like a wad of gum.
What gum are they chewing?
The gum you like, apparently.
That's not coming back in style. There's no point where that's gonna come back in style.
Or it's Margaret's pitch.
It could be potentially gum. I didn't physically see it as gum, mostly because of the translucent layer that exists on the outside of it. So maybe amongst this overall wrapping that there is a piece of gum on the inside. Regardless, this entity is horrifying. There's 2 entities inside this, and I did not expect Twin Peaks The Return, or Twin Peaks material in general, to give me something where I have to contemplate, how do I feel about the monster designs here?
Look, I thought it was very cute. I think the evolution of the arm is...
That's fine.
I want a plushie. I want a plushie
If you want a sharp-ass plushie, fine.
Actually, that'd be an incredible plushie now that I'm thinking about it.
That would be a very intricate plushie.
With, like, big, thick, soft branches, so not even, like, pokey. They just make them almost look like little soft little fingers on little arms, and then having the big wad plushie. Oh, that'd be so cute.
It'd be so cute. In any case, whether you think that something is cute or any sort of fantasies you want to give to a monster design, These are, I would say, between this and a future monster design, very quality. Like, there's points where, like, you're seeing these overall strange physicalities to it that I didn't expect this horror element to go this far, and I'm actually very much loving it.
David Lynch has a knack for this, and I think, we've explored a lot of things together.
We've explored a lot
I
of
have
things.
not shown you, I don't believe, the David Lynch art book that I have, right?
You have not.
So I don't think you've gone down that rabbit hole yet. And I will just say that David Lynch's art book might help you understand where this side of him comes from, because there are a lot of art pieces he's made that have monstrosities.
And that's exciting for me because for the most part, I would say that there's still like presences and there's still like playing and dabblings with it. I think the most extreme example, though, that really pushed it up to the return was all the way back in Eraserhead
Yes.
with the baby. I don't
That's
think
the
that he
best
hasn't
thing.
dealt with the physicality of such things since then.
And not just even the baby, but like the giant heads that would appear
Yes.
toward the end of the movie. No, and this is why, again, I showed you all those movies, and even after showing you everything, there are still things I haven't shown you that come up, like the art pieces. And at some point, I do want to show you them. But suffice to say, he has had this side in him for a while. It just hasn't entered Twin Peaks this way before. I do want to mention, before I forget, the first thing that, well, I shouldn't say the first thing, but one of the first things that I thought of when I first watched Twin Peaks and I saw the evolution of the arm, I thought of like an axon neuron. I thought of like a dendrite situation. So I am no expert on these things. It's mostly remembering AP psychology class in high school.
Yeah.
But the design of the ball at the top with the branches below reminded me of like a neuron in the brain. And then when I think of axons, I think of Inland Empire, Axon N, right? So in my head canon, I thought of like, this is an electrical wire of brain because electricity goes through the synapses of the brain. And given how much the Red Room is a psychological element of the mind, that's still kind of my headcanon when I see it. I do acknowledge it's definitely a tree.
So in this respect, the overall reaching out of the arm, if you will, and also paralleling that with the mind, a mind reaching out to you.
There's a lot of things that are compelling about viewing it as simultaneously a tree that is a conductor with a gum head, as well as also viewing it as a brain axon or dendrite situation where it's passing information and electrical impulses the way, hypothetically, one might experience during REM state when they're going through a dream. You know, electric activity in the brain. So I headcanon that pretty hard. Whether that's the intent or not, who's to say? But it's similar enough that I'm like, it's a dendrite.
The delight in your face when you say this is a dendrite.
This would be such a... I wish I could go back in time when we did that special... I think it was a special feature pod. Maybe it was a look back. We talked about merch opportunities.
Yeah, merch opportunity. I wanted to know what you freaking reference here.
I couldn't have said it even, could I have?
No, you couldn't say, I want a dendrite. I was like, what the hell is that? What the hell are you talking about? Are you okay, Kalil?
Anyway, we do know it's the same character, or supposed to be. Maybe the Pokemon evolution of. Because he does say, I am the arm, and I sound like this. And he does the whooping sound.
But it's more so concentrated because, like, thankfully, thanks to the monster design, you can't make the overall, for one, very off sort of, like, gesture.
Right.
But also, it has that weird pulsation, that weird sort of like crackle.
It's almost like a sucking sound with like electrical sounds. I forget how the subtitles worded it, but it did emphasize the electric element of it in the subtitle. And the evolution of the arm asks if he remembers the doppelganger. It cuts back to the doppelganger, how excited he is, how laughing he was. And this is where I do want to, again, state something that'll probably be popping in now and then. When I first watched The Return, one of my immediate disappointments was that I always wanted to see, ever since seeing the finale of season 2, I wanted to see that doppelganger. I wanted to see a Mr. C that was giddy and excited and mischievous. And the Mr. C we got is cold, calculated, almost lacking emotion entirely. And at first, not gonna lie, my emotion was disappointed. As time has gone on, that has changed. I very much enjoy the Mr. C that we have. He's very much a highlight of these first 2 parts for me. Do I still wonder what season 3 would have looked like if the show had come back and they could have given us that Mr. C, that doppelganger coupe? Of course, I still wonder.
Of course, like, I love unhinged performances inside of something such as Twin Peaks. I think that emphasis on Ray Wise's performance is quite nice. But if you wanted to see an unhinged version of someone who has been influenced by lodge spirits but still is very eloquent, Windham Earl.
Right, I
Literally
knew you were going to
Windham
go
Earl.
there.
Like, and that also brings up the greater question, if you will, for my end, if you will. It's like, Windham Earl, is that Windham Earl, or is that Doppel Windham from a different time?
Sure.
So I think that's an obvious question to point out, especially with that sort of unhinged nature. Windham Earl's, like, from what I understand from the general timeline between Catherine's death and what happens, it still is... It's not like 25 years of separation, if you will. So having that sort of like frantic, if you will, imp-like quality that Doppelkoop could have, like maybe that's just a path Windham Earl may have fallen down himself in the past. But that's a large bit of speculation on my part. Regardless, 25 years could do a lot to people, especially since it seems that whatever this entity is could potentially have a certain goal in mind. Like, it seems very directed.
It is very interesting. And in my mind... You get this idea being put forward that this entity can change the same way that people change. And if we find out that, from the evolution of the arms, quote, that he must come back in before you can go out, there's the idea that you can't have Mr. C and Dale Cooper at the same time. It leads me to believe that if you did like a DNA test, right, of Mr. C, it would 100% be Dale Cooper, I'm thinking. So that you literally can't have two of the exact same person at the same time, meaning that this is the Dale Cooper of Earth. Like, this is the Dale Cooper is walking around in the same body, basically, is how I'm imagining it. So what I'm getting at then is that just the same way that Dale Cooper over 25 years can change, so can this entity walking around, because it seems to be just as much a person.
It seems that he's currently, like, only one head can be attached to the body, if you will. The spiritual meeting with the physical. I think that's more on the overall interesting corpse later, but still.
Sure.
I think thematically there's a lot playing around with the sense of, like, those dualities.
I also want to say, while Windham Earl was being brought up, I think Mr. C in part 1 and part 2 already establishes himself as way more threatening than Windham Earl ever was.
Oh, God. No, this is way more threatening than anything.
More
I would
than
argue.
Jean Renault, more than Bob with Leland. Because at least with Bob with Leland, he had a slow pace about these killings. He killed people who were in a vulnerable position, and it seems like it wasn't a consistent, like, approach. He couldn't just waltz into an area and destroy everything. Mr. C has so much power and command over what he's doing that he seems like a threat level way higher than the villains of season 1 and season 2.
No, Mr. C is one of the most threatening beings here because Cooper is so sort of like intuitive, thoughtful, and overall is able to lean into his overall intelligence in a way, mixed in with this overall killer style that is tense. When he speaks, he grabs your attention and takes them through a stranglehold. And it's something that I wasn't expecting too much, mostly because I recognized like the doppelkoop, if you will, to be branching out to Bob in a way. And I think that it's very nice that we have that sort of like Bob parallel inside this. Frank Silva sadly passed away before he could be present in here, but I think that they make an interesting compromise by adding a new sort of like physical element to Cooper, and that being his longer hair, if you will.
Yeah, he's kind of synthesized with Bob, so to speak. There was a scene where Mr. C passes by a reflecting window or mirror, and I was looking to see, if they were going to do anything with that, and it doesn't look like they did.
I don't think they could, really, personally. Okay. There's only, maybe they could get someone to replace physically to sort of, have Frank Silva pass by. I don't think that they're going to do that. I think that having the entities not being that separate, but being as one, as they're moving forward onto this direct goal, I think it sets them apart from, say, for example, Leland as well as Bob. I think that this is singularly, the head is taken completely over with the body. They are completely new as a one being.
So you do think they've kind of synthesized, and that Bob is no longer indistinguishable, is indistinguishable from Mr. C at this point?
Yeah, I think that at this point, Mr. C is the entity of Bob fully taking over Cooper's body and intelligence, and this is just a new person.
So you don't think you'll ever see Bob separate again?
No, I think we will, because there is a threat that we receive that Bob will be reunited, if you will.
Sure, it is brought
because
up.
that is the impending doom, it seems, for Mr. C. Mr. C is apparently doing everything in his power
to stay. And it's
for one
interesting
reason or another.
it seems like no one's on Mr. C's side, which makes him seem all the more imposing, the fact that everyone in every reality seems to be against this guy. And he's still doing pretty good.
He's able to take complete control of the situation to the point that when you see him working with these other factions, when you see him kind of doing whatever the hell he wants, when you see him speak quietly, if you will, you look at other situations where like stuff is happening and there's like this fearful like person people are talking about. It's not too hard to believe that maybe Mr. C has literally his thumb in every pie he can find.
Or soup, if we want to call back to our earlier episodes. Because we have reason to believe that Mike and the evolution of the arm are not on Mr. C's side, because they're very clearly nudging Dale Cooper to like replace him and bring the other guy back. So it seems by association, at the moment, they are closer to Mr. Dale Cooper than they are Mr. C, and they are also not on Bob's side right now.
But that's also the terms of like, why is Dale Cooper's body on a rental period? Why is it that Dale Cooper's body must return? Why is it appropriate? It's to try to suss out the details of like, what is the Red Room and what are the limitations of the Red Room and how the Red Room ends up dealing with things and why that's so important to try to get Bob back. Because at the end of the day, there is a series of losses from Cooper. There's a series of issues in which Cooper must lose one way or another. And yet, for some reason, they're like, yeah, no, it's time for you to go. It was a great run, Cooper. It's been a great 25 years. But your credit card's been declined. You got to go. But unfortunately, like, you had to make sure that someone picks you up from the door. We can't just let you out there.
The way my brain's kind of working right now is I think of a lot of, like, mythologies and religions, especially, like, religions that are polytheistic, where you might have a god that kind of just goes rogue from time to time, where it's like the other gods aren't trying to destroy him or necessarily get rid of him, but it's more like, okay, we need to stop this one from screwing this up. And it also seems, going by Fire Walk with Me, that Bob has a tendency to kind of hoard Garmonbozia. And if I'm looking at the situation with Mr. C, if he hasn't returned in 25 years, he probably got a big bill. He's probably accrued a lot on his tab.
The biggest example being that there's literally a conversation where, like, the arm, evolutionary arm, as well as Mike are, like, standing in the same room, and Mike says, like, something's wrong. Like, they're actively recognizing. And when the magical entities in this paranormal space that's beyond, like, initial comprehension start saying, like, oh, shit. Yeah. That's when the panic starts setting in.
Something's going on that's even beyond them. Like, that's how much Mr. C is a presence right now.
Yes.
Is that they're not even sure what's going to happen here. Also, again, cryptic numerology moment. The evolution of the arm says 257 time and time again. Any thoughts on 257?
Not yet! Like, the only thing that I got is, like, 325, 350, but that's just because I remember, like, there was the three numbers for Cooper's room, and I think I even got that wrong. I think it might even be 350. Regardless, there's a separate number that has, like, I thought would have importance, but realized it doesn't have importance.
We got 430, and we got 257.
Yeah. They're gonna
two
maybe
abstract
come
numbers
back later.
Time and time again.
Time and time again. You said 270 was the other word, right?
What? 257.
257. Okay, so it still can fit on a clock.
It's also a very unusual number. Like, it's not a very, like, it's not a multiple of, it's a pretty strange random number.
If I told you that I want to have dinner at 2:57, would you be punctual?
I would, but I'd be very curious what's going to happen to me. Like, you hired an assassin or something? Like, why does it matter? What's happening here?
As opposed to, like, 3.
430 is not that suspicious. 257 is. Given our talk about Bob, and you feel like we'll probably still see him in some way separately?
I think we're going to see him, or at the very least, by the conclusion, we're going to have something happen that will be definitive for either Bob and or Cooper.
Okay.
And or Mr. C.
And or Mr. C. I do want to point out that as we were looking at the credits, we do get in both episodes a statement that these episodes were in memory of someone. And part 1 was in memory of Frank Silva, who is the actor who plays Bob. And then part 2 was dedicated to Catherine Coulson, the actor who played Margaret Lanterman. So starting off the show with dedications to 2 of the most iconic faces and characters in all of Twin Peaks.
It's very interesting and unique that they are dedicating each episode. And I think it's like a recognizable sort of like in memoriam in, say, for example, a section of a park. And each section of the park is a separate part for those we've unfortunately lost due to the overall moving tides of time.
Mm-hmm. And Cooper, trying to move through the tides of the red curtains, is trying to leave this place he's been stuck in for 25 years. And he's told to go, but when he tries to go to the end of a hallway, he ends up getting blocked.
I love the fact that, like, he's told, like, it's time to go. It's time to go. You can move and go. But remember, the other coop has to come back. So he goes to the door, and what happens? Oh, he can't go through because guess what? The other coop's not back.
So that's your interpretation of that?
That's my interpretation of that. Mr. C is not there. It does not seem that we have any return goods that's becoming present inside of here. It's stated that he cannot move with air, and I think that's just because the body can only really hold one full inhabitant at a time, which makes the more situations like whenever Bob enters into Leland more curious, if you will.
Well,
it feels like this is like a
make it
separate...
Curious.
It makes it feel like the doppelganger is much more of a separate entity.
Well, and they've both aged, so I don't even know how time works on their bodies. It does raise a lot of questions. I think one way you can square it away, that makes sense in my mind at least, is that Dale Cooper is almost in the subconscious of Mr. C, in the sense that only one mind can take over the same body, but they do still share the same aging. It's just that one of them is active and one of them is not. So I almost think of it as an on and off switch.
Okay.
So you're currently on Mr. C mode. You have to flip it to get to Dale Cooper mode, and it is still aging the same body. That'd be my guess. But then we also, again, do see Leland and Laura, whatever they are in their age, and they have the backwards speak, so who knows how much we're supposed to take that seriously.
All I know is that it makes still Glastonbury Grove very suspicious, like, say, for example, for the entrance-exit, especially since we literally have Hawk entering that area at one point of the episode, it would seem.
Right, and I almost headcanon it to the idea that Dale Cooper trying to go through that first entrance and he couldn't go back. I like to believe that was the entrance to Glastonbury Grove, and that it's again, more of the reinforcing from a meta angle that this is not the old Twin Peaks. You cannot go back the same way you wanted to. Season 3 did not air in 1991.
Yeah.
It's airing in 2017. So you have to go through the other door. Please use the other door, the 2017 door.
Use the other door. It's Cooper being stuck in this situation. Mr. C being out and about, desperately trying to preserve himself. I don't think it's too far-fetched for me to say that this overall idea of preservation or trying to gather back what once was will likely not end well for a larger message from, say, for example, The Return, to say not to go to the past. The past is this future or is this past. I think that everyone lives so much inside the present moment and the past moment that the inevitable conclusion in order for a brighter future must mean that the present and the past must be left behind for the future to flourish. Hence
you
why...
You have to kill the past.
You have to kill the past.
To quote the Suda 51 idea.
You have to kill the past as well as move past from the present in order to get forward to the future, I think. And I do think that that's where Mr. C and Cooper, even though this is going to be a heavy plot point throughout, I don't think it's going to end well for either of them, personally. I don't think that Cooper trying to escape is going to end well for himself. I don't think that Cooper is going to end up having a happy ending by the end of this. I do truly feel that in order to fully kill off this past, it's going to lead into this dead body, this dead corpse, similar to the one that we see fallen at the beginning of this overall new series.
And shout out to a fellow podcast. I haven't checked out their stuff yet, but I do want to check it out when I have more time. But Twin Peaks Evangelion is a podcast that talks about Twin Peaks as well as the anime series Neon Genesis Evangelion. And I bring this up because I feel like this is a moment of overlap where both of these series, a lot of your resolution to move forward is to be willing to let go of those attachments to the past and those hangups to the past that are creating barriers, so to speak. So I think that for those who know this other reference, this other esoteric, confusing work that is Evangelion, Shinji and Asuka have to move forward if they're going to live, as well as other characters like Misato. And if they try to hold on to these past relationships, these past hangups, these past guilts, they end up falling into a ooze. A status quo ooze.
A status quo ooze. No, most certainly when you try to resist the river will only push.
Cooper is pushed into a new room where Leland is there.
Hey, Leland, how's it going? It's great to see you. How have you been? We haven't seen you in forever, especially since you died. Yeah.
And he says, find Laura. He tells Cooper to find Laura. What? Because that's one of the most out of left field moments so far because, okay, one, he just talked to Laura 5 minutes ago, and then, according to the credits, and then two, Cooper's mission right now is to get Mr. C back and put him, do a switcheroo? Uno reverse card? So what does Laura have to do with this? So what do you make of Leland saying to find Laura?
Laura still seems to be somewhat of an important figure, especially since this is sort of like the larger event that got everyone into this situation between Leland as well as Laura. Laura, with whatever autonomy that she seems to have, whatever mystical nature that she seems to have, and whatever attendant status that she seems to have, she is far more, I would say, stronger than what Leland is depicted as. Someone who seems that overall pressed into a chair, almost shackled down, if you will.
Sure, he seems deflated.
Yes. Meanwhile, Laura is able to move freely, as well as has a gauge of certain knowledge, if you will, judging by what she's able to whisper into Cooper's ear and what sort of discoveries he has. I think that Laura is just going to lead into some answers for either Cooper to break out or something that is at the very least important to a resident of the Red Room that is now Leland Palmer.
I think your interpretation also will shift depending on how what status you read Leland as. Is this Leland that Cooper sees another aspect of Cooper's mind, and it's that Leland part of the brain who is constantly stuck, fixated on Laura? Or is it is really the soul of Leland Palmer who is still stuck on finding Laura? So Leland is always repeating that like a ghost just stuck on repeat, a broken record, one could say. Or is this a command? Like, is this something that Cooper's supposed to listen to from a lodge spirit? I don't know if that's clear right now. Is this the angel on the shoulder, the devil on the shoulder, or the brain in between the shoulders?
How much of this is like one of each of these options that you select them? How much of them blend together?
Right. Anyway, Cooper interacts with another entity where the something is wrong comes in, and we find out that the evolution of the arm has a doppelganger.
We already knew that the arm had a doppelganger. We saw the arm have a doppelganger inside of the final episode of season 2.
It's good that both of them could grow and change over lifetime.
The difference is that instead of like this overall entity that seems over like a little shaky and a little dancey, but just has over glazed over white eyes, but still seems to keep the general physicality, it's when Cooper kind of like looks out into the scape, sees Mr. C driving down a desert road beyond one of the curtains. Very interesting to have that overall view from beyond the curtains, but still nonetheless looks out from beyond. The statue at the end of the hall shifts form almost like a mimic, in which like is no longer this like white marble statue, turns into the tree, but instead like the tree doesn't have eyes, right? So in order to like distinguish the physicality of this overall tree, it's more so of like a
yellowy,
disgusting
mucusy
yellow
mustard
sort of like set through. Like it's weird that for some reason this doppelganger has more color. Hence why I'm looking out for details if we have future doppelgangers on, if those physicalities have changed too, if there's a new sort of shorthand for doppelganger, or if this is just unique to the evolution of the arm.
And it seems like, I mean, there's multiple ways to read this, but it seems like Cooper was about to do something different than what the evolution of the arm forced to happen, in the sense the evolution of the arm basically broke open the floor beneath Cooper and dropped him, whereas I don't think that was supposed to be part of Mike or the regular evolution's plan. This is the something is wrong.
I think that a lot of forces inside of the overall lodge that we saw initially, with the exception of Doppelcoop, is that the time that you spend inside of the lodge is still very passive. It's something that you're experiencing. You're seeing visions that you are being brought forward. For one, it's already notable that Doppelcoop is the only one that really like grabs onto Cooper after Bob just basically told him to run, maybe in some sort of like game-like fashion, like tee-hee, flee. But it's also notable that something's wrong is uttered before this instance, because I don't believe that we've ever seen someone who is very apparently not part of the lodge being attacked outright. We've seen individuals that potentially, like Windham Earl having the soul warped out, but still being in that reverse speech pattern. It seems like this interaction between two forces doesn't usually naturally happen. I think for the most part, even the entities inside of the place might be going a little bit rogue. Like there's something wildly imbalanced happening to
There's
the
a
point.
coup happening in the spirit world right now.
There's a coup happening in the spirit world as this
Doppelgangers
creature
unite.
lashes out against Coop, and Coop is flung down into the waters and flung into the strange overall time space. Maybe that's the overall Red Room itself protecting Cooper, or maybe that is the arm, evolution of the arm, doppelganger, actually lashing out, and that's the action. I'm thinking more so the former than the latter, mostly because...
So you think the floor falling out was to help him?
I think the floor was...
To get him out of there.
I think that's the floor and the overall space helping him out, get out of that, because the arm flails around like in a future scene where we see this overall strange-mouthed creature lash out and lead to a bloodied corpse.
Now, there's not a lot of clues to go off of because it could be either way. We do get a line from the doppelganger where it shouts, non-existent, which... What does that indicate to you?
It's recognizing, like, the doppelganger is behaving like a white blood cell, not necessarily defending, but lashing out at something that shouldn't be.
Like
good. It sees...
I'm glad we're an Osmosis Jones podcast.
It's seeing this overall version of Cooper no longer existing. This is a facet, an old idea of Cooper. Mr. C is where Cooper is right now. So looking out, trying to plot, trying to figure out a way to get out, and Cooper just trying to follow along those paths, and basically a spirit of the lodge, or even part of the lodge, rejecting him, saying like, no, you're non-existent, you're not part of here, and then trying to act against him, because there's nothing non-threatening about this overall doppelganger.
It is threatening.
It is very threatening.
It's the most threatening wad of gum on a tree I've ever encountered.
Hence why is it the overall Lodge spirit acting out, just flinging him away because he is non-existent, or is it something in which like it's trying to get away before this Lodge spirit can do something stronger?
We have noticed before in the season 2 finale the idea of potentially a doppelganger going after Cooper before, because we do get Doppel Laura screaming and running toward Cooper, right?
We do.
So there is a sense of which maybe there is a precedent here.
Maybe there's a precedent. It's just how far is it that we have something that fits inside of a horror house in which something scares, frightens, and tries to gesture an action from someone, as opposed to literally a tree with branches flinging out with the mouth wide open. That's a more threatening gesture than Laura could ever give off.
Fair enough. I was more scared by Laura than I was by this tree, but that's fair enough. It seems like, regardless of whether the doppelganger evolution sent Cooper here, or if the lodge had to quickly react to what was going on, it wasn't part of the plan for Cooper to smack down on that glass box. Is that fair?
I don't think it was necessarily part of the plan. I think that it still ended up being the journey.
It's either a backup plan or it is the evolution of the arm's doppelganger throwing it off course.
It's something that's being thrown off at the very least, because Cooper is now in a new space that we see that hovers over New York, in which there's a glass box that is present there. More thoughts on that when we go deeper into the glass box with other characters, because knowledge that we discover about this place. But regardless, we have a Cooper floating around as the overall Sam and company looking off in the other room, before suddenly the entire area shifts, shudders, the perspective of Cooper kind of falls forward and back as metallic sounds clang around, and Cooper's on a wild ride.
And last we see of him in part 2 is that he is being basically ejected into this void, this starry void, shaking and whooshing violently. Which, again, we don't know yet. How bad is this? Is this like just a slight detour, a longer way around the board in the board game, or did he get shifted to a different board game?
I like to think, like, out of the characters that come out of like Briggs's research, like as soon as like things are being typed and messages come through, there's just like a full on like icon of like Cooper that's like for some reason stamped on. There's no key that's a Cooper key, but overall Cooper being flung into space and literally Cooper's just there on the page. That's what I imagine from an instance like this. Cooper just being flung onto a page of Briggs's reports.
So we've already talked about the glass box in terms of what it does for Cooper. We did get a new romantic duo of Sam and Tracy. New characters. What'd you think of Sam and Tracy?
Names are extremely forgettable, and so are their people and personalities, and I imagine that they would likely usually have a musical accompaniment, but do not. They are just two awkward young adults who want to fuck.
I think the operative word is awkward. I know that in David Lynch's filmography, there's a tendency for stilted performances, that he goes for that sometimes. But I don't know. There's a very clear line in the sand between some of these characters and how they perform, in the sense of, would I be wrong to accuse Sam and Tracy's performances of being bad? Because, like, Phyllis also kind of gets there, too, where it's like, Phyllis is told later, you imitate human behavior perfectly well, so something's going on with Phyllis. Sam and Tracy, do they imitate human behavior? Are they human? Because the way they talk to each other is not common.
Aren't you a naughty girl? Looking over my shoulders at
wow.
my keypad.
I'm so interested. You've driven me wild.
You know you can't go into that other room. It's very important to know this.
These are obviously performances done on purpose, right? Like, this is how Lynch is directing them to act, right?
Maybe?
So, why?
I've worked enough inside theater to see performances like this.
I feel like David Lynch would recast.
Are you sure?
If that was the case.
Are you sure? Because we have seen some interesting sort of overall dialogue, performances, and choices that, sure, some of them meld very well with the overall foreground, but I wouldn't say, like, everything's been knocked out of the park. I think that having a performance that's somewhat this stilted, whether it is intentional or not intentional, still creates a groove and a feeling of almost looking into something that seems off. I say that because it feels like
artificial.
Artificial, yes. I think that it feels like that because either the soap opera and or porno leaking in which there is
fan fiction dialogue almost. Like, and I don't mean to disparage fan fiction, but the general quality of someone trying to imitate dramatic dialogue, but it doesn't come across as natural at all. Yeah. It feels like it's written more than said.
The tongue is in the cheek, and in both cheeks sometimes.
Yeah. So Sam and Tracy, we don't get much of them, and presumably they got sliced and diced, so we don't know how much we're going to see them in the future. I mean, I do, you don't.
Yeah, no, they end up sort of like in this creature, this weird freaking creature, just absolutely, like, unless they come out A-okay and that was some sort of vision, I don't foresee many people walking out all right after their nude bodies have been slathered with slashes. I didn't even know what part. Was there teeth? Was there claws? All I saw was right in front of them. Like, if you haven't seen The Return, that's exactly how the scene feels when it's going against it, in a frightening way. Imagine in a frightening way.
So the scene did work for you.
The scene very much worked for me. I
thought the buildup was really good.
I think the buildup was really good. I think that the overall creature staying as far as it was and as long as it was in almost like a small corner until kind of coming out in this way and having jittery edits. It does remind me at like a transition period on something such as almost like a cheap horror monster movie scare, but it's how long the presence of this being is and how long it's willing to play with these sort of like camera shifts. That genuinely it turns out to go from something that could be potentially very campy to something that acts like very much does work, I find.
And I think Sam and Tracy's responses are probably the most believable here than they are in their actual dialogue, because sometimes during a horror movie, you just want to scream at the characters like, run away, do something. But if you're in this chair and you've been told to watch this box for hours and hours and hours, you get paid a lot of money to sit and stare at a box for hours and nothing happens. Then all of a sudden that shows up. I'm not surprised Sam is just staring at it.
Not to mention, this is a very much lockdown facility. Like, it'll take time for that door to open. So seeing this overall creature and just trying to, like, watch it and be like, okay, what now, is, I think, a fair...
I think the fight or flight instinct and just staying still and, like, not knowing what to do or how to react or how to move, you know, that's what it reminds me of. Like, it's just, there's no way to even react to it. You're just kind of stuck in transition mode. I feel like that's where they're at. I buy into their reaction there. I'm also very much on Team Sex Magic.
Team Sex Magic. I'm sorry. Let's elaborate.
So, within interpretations, right? I'm pretty big on the headcanon that, like, the fact that these two were having the interactions of the nude sexual kind. I'm going to assume that that's partly what partly what summons it, right? Because in The Secret History of Twin Peaks, we have this idea of sex magic brought up when we're dealing with the occult. And knowing that love and fear open the doors, if we're going by season 2 with Annie and Cooper. I think the involvement of Sam and Tracy having sex being the only clear variable that separates thing appearing versus thing not appearing in their reality it's hard not to draw a parallel to that, unless you just want to make it all coincidence that this happened to happen at that time due to things going on with Cooper.
But of course, with the noting of Cooper, that this might be where the exception also comes in. They come in shortly after, but since Coop is gone, if the doorway is technically still a little bit open, if you will, and something comes through, it's not that I'm against any sort of aspect of this creature appearing that's in a reflection of themselves that is also in response to their overall sexual nature. Not that's still something that I very much keep in the playing field, but I think it's very notable if we use our overall timeline and patch these two places together. Would they have seen Cooper, if you will, if this guy was still just sitting there all alone, if you will? What happened in the 5 minutes beforehand?
This is where, again, we're dabbling in speculation.
Yes.
I'm thinking right now, and you can respond, is I think that the two individuals having sex was done intentionally in the sense that security guard went away at a time where it made it possible for Tracy to come in and do this.
Yes.
And given Tracy's suspicious nature of looking at the codes when he's punching him in, it's unclear if she's hired by a different party or the same party that's paying this guy.
Yeah.
Unclear. Either way, I think that it was purposeful that the guard was gone to let her come in to have sex on this day, that might cause something to open. That might be what opens a doorway that then allows Cooper to slide in, but also the thing that either was pursuing Cooper or just happened along at the same time.
I mean, it's very notable because if that is the case, it's really dependent on what the sexual nature is. If she was simply allowed through the door and that act were to happen, would that evoke the same result? I don't think so. I think the forbidden nature of what they're doing,
it's a forbidden. Yeah, it's not in the natural context of it. We also don't know the history of these two people, even how well they know each other. They know each other by their names, but that's all we really get as far as a history.
Now that is if you are to assume that this is where the tests are going through, where these are the results that they're trying to seek by using these variables, purposely putting these variables and moving them forward. The guard still remains a mystery, but that is very compelling. The only thing that I would posit forward in a counteract, if you will, is the question of who is funding this and why. The reason why I bring that up is because if it is
it's an unknown billionaire,
we know a place that has a lot of money called Vegas in a high little tower in which apparently there's someone of drastic influence pushing people to do actions that they might not usually do. It doesn't have to be the billionaire themselves who have to do the action, just simply someone who could be potentially pushing that money,
right?
If you will. You see where I'm kind of looking at for this potential
Spell
case.
it out for me.
There's a little bit of me that wonders if Mr. C's trying to play all angles and going with all sorts of intuition, if he could be potentially a threatening figure, threatening powerful people to fund and put these into play to keep an eye out on Cooper, if you will, knowing this is a place where he can overall land and sort of keep those tabs, if only to make sure that there's some form of prevention. That might show that this is an example of this is being more of a security measure more than an active testing place.
So there's a lot of things going on here with this glass box. First of all, I want to say that I appreciate it just on its own as a very distinct visual of the box, distinct visual of what comes out of that box. Everything around it is so mysterious and paced so tensely that regardless of what it means, I think it's very effective mood and atmosphere-wise. Now, beyond that, I think it works on several layers. From a literal level, it seems to be something that is a magnet or a glue of some kind, that it brings things in. Now, was the intention to A, get Cooper, bring Cooper into the box, B, bring whatever came after Cooper into the box, or C, none of those things, they just happened to come around. We don't know right now. If this was Mr. C funding it, it's not that hard to believe that this was flypaper meant to attract Cooper should the doppelganger succeed in driving Cooper out.
My thoughts exactly.
Makes sense. But it could also just as equally be some sort of sex magic to bring across a demon like in Secret History, because that second thing seems like a demon you'd bring with sex magic. Now,
I want that on the t-shirt. That seems like a demon you would bring out with sex magic.
Now, on the meta angle, right, I'm going to go there and say, this is a glass box. People looking into a glass box, waiting for something to happen. That kind of sounds like someone watching a TV show, doesn't it? Now, I know TVs nowadays are made different than they were in the 90s, but still the idea of the black outside of a glass box waiting for something to happen. And there's some choice dialogue where, even though it's delivered so strangely, maybe that's to highlight it, you've got Tracy literally wearing gold triangle earrings, Twin Peaks, right?
Ha.
Each one is one triangle, two, and she says, a secret. You're driving me crazy. There's this idea of allure to the mystery of wanting to know what happens, waiting to see what happens. It's taking so long for something to happen, and then it gets you, and then it kills you. So if we go the meta angle, it seems like it's the idea of waiting and watching and wanting something to happen, and they miss when Cooper's actually there. You miss the thing you maybe were looking for, and you come back distracted for whatever the sexuality represents, and get eviscerated. I don't know if we're safe as viewers, if that's the metaphor. What is David Lynch going to do to us?
Like my cat? My cat is staring at me intently as you were saying that. Stella, do you have anything to say?
I just think the guard leaving is the most suspicious element of this probably being set up. Because the guard, when the little interaction we get of him, he seems so dead set on like watching what they're doing. He's a private security guard. He's being paid probably even, a lot of money to do this. Him being gone seems odd. Like, that seems like for this guy, seemed like he was on duty. He wasn't like sneaking away.
Literally has a bathroom right next to his post. Like, it seems like he is specifically stationed in a spot that would be opportune for him never having to leave.
And that's why I think Tracy coming in there was something that was being accounted for as a possibility, or even possibly orchestrated. She might be being paid to do all this.
He just didn't want to pay for the DoorDash, okay? He didn't want to pay the extra fees. He went down to get carry out.
As far as anonymous billionaires, other rich people we know, obviously we know that Ben Horn is a man of money. Catherine Martell may, in fact, be a billionaire by this point.
Yes, but...
And then as far as new characters, Phillip Jeffries appears to have connections.
Phillip Jeffries seems to have connections. Phillip Jeffries still very suspicious in all sorts of regards. Catherine, I have no clue, like, what's connections she would have or what interest
Jerry Horn,
should
off
have
of
for
his
this.
weed business. He might be a billionaire.
That's the fun part, isn't it? Like, there's Jerry as well as Ben.
I'm just throwing out other ideas if it's not Mr. C. One piece of evidence we can use to see how it sways you is that in the credits, we do get a name very much implied for the thing in the box that appears after Cooper. And so in the credits, there is someone named Erica Einon who is listed as the model for this character, because in the credits, she is experiment model. So you can interpret then that if she is the model for the experiment, we are calling this thing the experiment. We don't get a name said anywhere else, so that's what I got. But if you look up Erica Ainon's involvement, that is what she's playing.
It is something that's very professional to the point and doesn't take up as much credit space as spooky, weird monster in glass box. Ooh, ah.
So, what do you make of it being called an experiment? Does that change or shift your interpretations in any direction?
This is something that, by the standards of what is happening, whether intentional or not, is a form of experiment, if you will. It is throwing out a amount of work and dedication to see potential outcomes being observed by external force. So yes, this is outright, whether or not one intentions one way or another, an experiment of sorts. And having something be produced out of that, I think experiment is a more than fitting name.
There's also the possibility, I've kind of teased at it, but given the sequential order, it is possible that this experiment was pursuing Cooper. In the sense that Cooper shows up, he gets warped out, and then next thing shows up as this.
Yes.
So we don't know that. For all we know, it's like picking up frequencies and you're tuning a radio, which feels very much in line with the thinking of electricity, right? It might have just crossed over to a frequency you shouldn't cross over to, and that's what let this thing in. But there is the realistic possibility if it was chasing Cooper, that's why it's here. And if we go by that logic, given the way its mouth is shaped, it isn't very different from the evolution of the arm.
No.
It's just that you notice that the model here is definitely having breasts and looking more what we would call probably a female entity.
Physically humanoid with overall what seems to be mutations and shifts in the overall head, if you will. A very strange lopsided head.
With again, a very much a mouth similar to what maybe I could imagine the enraged form of the evolution could be. So that's the question too, is this experiment connected to the evolution of the arm, chasing Cooper, or is it not related to that thing at all? There's a lot more mysteries than there is certainties right now. There's also, if we're looking at smaller background details, there isn't really much in the room with the glass box, although next to where Sam sits, there is a small potted plant. There's one piece of organic life in a room that's otherwise electronic
Very
devices.
electronic, very cement-filled, as this overall Sam, not Stanley, observes and takes information.
So that plant might mean something, maybe.
Plant might mean something.
Given that it's sitting next to the people, and then also next to where Sam and Tracy would be, there's a short lamp and a tall lamp, one on each side, which makes me think of the waiting room, because you've got the mystery man, or the man from the place, I should say, man from the place being the shorter individual, and the giant being the taller, as depicted on the Owl Cave petroglyphs. So the repetition of short and tall, the repetition of the plant life, the tree, gives this room a subtle, almost subconscious red room energy without necessarily being that. It subliminally is suggesting a connection, again, to the armchairs that you see in the red room as well. Except instead of waiting to see what comes behind a curtain, you're looking at the screen. I don't know. There's something very compelling, I think, to the parallels that are almost there. That are almost there. And I remember you remarking off pod that it reminds you a bit of Silent Hill.
Oh, yes.
Was this the aspect, I'm guessing, was mainly this creature's monster design?
This creature's monster design, as well as the tree-like monster design. I know that there's, like, mostly, like, humanoid from what I recognize from Silent Hill, but there still is something that looks familiar, yet in a way uncanny and warped. That
Often
I think,
sexually.
that I think that is generally vibing off of both like styles of design between like Silent Hill monsters and between something such as Twin Peaks. I believe that you made a comment beforehand in which it's funny how like somewhat full circle this overall becomes, not only like with this overall idea of like inspirations, but also on like David Lynch's earlier work to now with things such as all these.
Eraserhead, the grandmother, I think is worth discussing because once you and I popped in the Blu-ray HD version and saw what appeared over the kid at the end, there's a sense in which these sort of monstrosities that were probably very influential to other creators, such as the people who made Silent Hill, would now come back, and David Lynch is bringing some of those other ideas from his more artwork side into this. And I don't think that David Lynch ever really played or watched someone play Silent Hill. I don't see David Lynch as a video game person, but it is, again, interesting to draw those parallels nonetheless. Because the return jumps suddenly to new locations, we're also going to jump suddenly to new locations, to Buckhorn, South Dakota. We know that originally there was some talks of Twin Peaks taking place in North Dakota before it eventually got set to Washington. Now we went a little south.
So close. So
close. So we're in Ruth's apartment, and there's some lady named Marjorie Green. It's got a little doggy named Armstrong, and they are drawn to this gross scent coming from the neighbor's apartment, the Ruth's neighbor.
Spoiler alert, it's death.
Now, that being said, did you suspect it being a dead body?
Yes.
Yeah, because it's such a distinct thing of like, oh, really powerful smell, mysterious, haven't seen this person in a while. Also, Mulholland Drive comes to my mind very quickly, because Mulholland Drive had that idea, too, of the reeking smell coming from it was like an apartment complex, right? But the idea of like this person who lived nearby noticing it's been a while since they were around, and then when you go in, it's the body horror. This feels similar in tone, and I think it works when it gets to the dramatic reveal of the body. I found it very chilling. As someone, again, who has a strong reaction, when I first watched The Return, I was really bothered by the dismembered head in the body. But rewatching it, I'm a bit more okay. I will acknowledge when I was fast-forwarding it to rewatch the show, I did kind of look away at that part because it kind of grosses me out. But what I don't think is effective as much, as we've said before, is the joking that goes on with Marjorie Green, who I think it's safe to say at this point we're not expecting to see a lot more of, are we? Like, it felt like a one-off gag.
Armstrong seems like a palpable character that's going to carry
the dog.
off. Yes, it's just specifically Armstrong.
Well, you see the moon landing, John F. Kennedy, and I don't know where you even go with that, but there's a lot of antics that happen here that don't seem to amount to very much. We get a ton of names being shoved at us about this guy named Barney, someone named Hank, who's not our Hank.
No, a separate criminal Hank, but not our criminal Hank.
And it's just this drawn-out sequence over and over and over. We get Chip being mentioned as Barney's brother, and one of the most disorienting things as a first-time viewer is we don't know if any of these names matter. Like, you're throwing Barney, Hank, and Chip, and you're not really sure if, like... Well, there's also a Harvey. Do I need to keep notes? Are these people important? Are they going to come up?
Doesn't matter if they come up or not. Always keep notes. I think that's half the fun here.
I don't find it very fun.
Well, too bad.
I find it tedious. I find the constant throwing of names to be more annoying than enjoyable. And this is, again, part of my overall critique of where The Return comes in. My favorite thing about the original show was the characters. One of my least favorite thing about the new show is the characters, in the sense that I don't care about a bunch of names being thrown around that don't mean anything or do anything. And I don't particularly like Marjorie Green. And the police officers are just police officers. They're fine. They don't strike an impression on me.
Other than like a few choice interactions, there's nothing that really feels personal here. It feels like either there is a gag at this moment, but the silence of the environment kind of like dampens that down, or elsewise it's something that is moving things forward. I think that there's like mild banter in front of a dead body, in which I was thinking to myself, oh, well, that's some like fun character right there. But beyond that, no, not really. We are just progressing the plot for the most part.
And it is interesting, too, because Harvey has this whole subplot where he's super suspicious. And not Harvey, but Hank has talking to Harvey on the phone, and they have like a bag, probably has money in it or something. It's unclear if that's related or unrelated to what's going on. I just find myself not caring. Like, I don't know, like, if I'm watching this for the first time, I don't know if that plot thread's going to reoccur or not, but I'm just kind of looking at it like, I don't know if I care about this. And the lack of music also doesn't help at all, because mood-wise, you get the scenes where Hank and Harvey are doing all the suspicious, shady stuff with the same neutral silence that you get Marjorie's comical moments, so it just all kind of muddles for me.
I think that almost it's kind of building up the environment to be a little bit untrustworthy, similar to what I would argue how Dear Meadow was sort of like trying to be emphasized with its overall shaky foundation, the overall strange interactions with other characters, and how people just generally behaved in that area. I think that sort of like style and behavior is coming out in this location, especially since it's notable around this dead body, in which I'm sure there might be some form of emphasis. I just don't know whether or not we're actually going to get to know any of the two dead individuals that we see there.
So we have Ruth, for sure, right? Ruth Davenport is the head. They've done a match on that.
Yes.
The body, we don't know yet. They're still trying to figure that out. Do you have any suspicions?
Well, for one, the biggest suspicion that I have is not necessarily the identity, but the meaning of the body being like how a body was discovered at the beginning of original Twin Peaks, how this one was discovered, but instead of being thematic in a sense of this one being wrapped up inside of like plastic to the point that it's almost like flowers being presented, something beautiful but also mournful, this is a case where unceremoniously the body is very much uncovered, literally uncovered, because the sheets uncover and everything is laid bare before them. So from judging from that, the separate head from the body, it feels like it's going to try to present everything on the table as far as the mystery is concerned, like lay it bare out for all to see, but also it's going to be playing with the separate identity similar to Cooper as well as Mr. C. I think that genuinely they use the death of characters at these establishing beginnings of the series in order to set up a tone for the rest of like the mystery, I suppose, the feel, the wonder of like the tone of the overall show. With that being said, I don't think it really matters who the body is, because the biggest aspect of it is that how unidentifiable that body is. Like, it's something that's they have no clue where it came from, how it is there. Again, matching up with the Mr. C angle, followed with the head being something recognizable because this person had been in the environment, recognizes this is their overall home. This is where that they should belong. So yeah.
From a meta angle, you've got this sort of distortion and perversion of what we're kind of used to for Twin Peaks, especially with regards to the wrapped in plastic idea of Laura. I can see that. I do wonder then, if you're going with the idea that the body doesn't matter, that's almost the opposite of Laura, where the idea that it was Laura is the one, was such a huge element of the show, especially starting on, that to have it be unceremonious and like random, it sounds like you're not thinking that either Ruth Davenport or the identity of the male body are ever going to hold that kind of importance that Laura did.
I don't think they're going to hold the same style of importance, more so. This overall body being unidentifiable, but also like sprawled out instead of being inside of something of a better presentation, if you will, being under the cover, something to uncover, if you will. I think that they're just different utilities entirely from different stories.
Okay.
We have Laura Palmer, who's absolutely important because all of the lives that we've sort of like been impacted with, and we've been able to center that around Twin Peaks as an area. As far as I'm concerned for Buckhorn, like, we're already jumping all over the damn place through different characters. I don't foresee us looking into the daily lives of Buckhorn. I don't foresee the people that Ruth surrounded herself being too impacted because for the most part, her neighbor is kind of aloof and it's like, oh, I barely even know about this or that stuff. I just kind of like do whatever I'm told, really. Well, like the staff members are either off inside of a mental hospital, off doing crimes.
Yeah.
I don't see many people digging into Ruth's life because even the person who was framed for the murder who put fingerprints around and was said that, hey, I was not involved with this person in this way, even just like attested to a dream being compelled to be in that place. I don't know how important Ruth is to everyone else's life other than a side note to other characters.
Isn't that what we got with Laura, though, too? We didn't really know except for the side notes.
Laura had a presence. No matter what, even if it was a side note, it was emotional impacts that they cry and weep for Laura. These people cry and weep because they got caught, they were involved with it, and this person ends up having this crime done against them. Benjamin Horne, who's implicated, thank you, for crimes, if you will, and for issues that would deal with a minor, if you will, it's still set up inside of somewhat of a romanticized angle where he truly felt that he loved her. He would break down, set into tears. I don't believe Bill was his name.
Yep, Bill Hastings.
I don't think Bill's going to break down in tears over this woman. I think he's going to break down in tears for himself.
And that seems to be a lot of what's happening so far is this worry that he's in a lot of trouble, but he's also insisting he didn't do it. So Bill Hastings' fingerprints all over this place. We meet Bill, we meet his wife, we lose his wife. What did you think of Bill Hastings so far? Like, do you believe he did it?
I believe that he did it in the same ways that the influence of the Lodge Bob or whatever it may be end up sort of pushing him into an angle. It's really the mystery of the wound. The mystery of the wound. With the eye seems to be completely shot out or something. It is completely caved in.
Which is not that different potentially from how Phyllis was shot by Mr. C.
My thoughts exactly.
Yes.
Like, sure, we get like a later scene with Mr. C in which he's able to like muffle a gunshot with an overall pillow, which again, very threatening how intelligent and how sort of like
it's the
peaceful
cold manner in which he's like, am I going to die? Yes. And then like 15 minutes, are you going to kill me now?
It was such a good scene.
Anyway.
Just like, it's not even like, yes. It's like, yes.
It's very...
Like, it's to the point.
To the point, matter
of fact. It is very much... If I've ever heard a yes with a period at the end, that was the delivery.
Yeah.
But going back to that, methodical killer with an excellent aim that is able to shoot out, especially whenever it comes to a centered head position. He shot every scene that we've seen, he shot these people in the head. And we've seen Cooper being an excellent shot inside of the overall series. Like, him with an overall gun in his hand is something to be very noted and very deadly.
Meanwhile, Bill is a high school principal who's also fishing buddies with like one of the local law enforcement officers.
Yeah, not known so well for those specific antics. And especially since we see Mr. C pop up in Phyllis's life later on, showing off Bill's gun. Like, it feels like a potential framing.
Small thing, but I would say in two parts that don't have a lot of humor in it, I think the funniest part for me was when Phyllis first answered the door, husband had to leave, and Phyllis shouts, "But the Morgans are coming for dinner!"
And yet that, with music, I can see being like a chuckle-worthy moment.
Yeah.
Without that, and just hearing the hum of the vehicles in the background, it feels weird.
Well, it's almost the idea you get when you have media that, like, for example, would insert laugh tracks where they don't belong. It's that same sort of dissonance where, like, especially since it has Twin Peaks as a comparison point, you have the original show's memory in your mind.
Yes.
Something feels off and missing here. You're getting the situation without the usual accompaniment. It's or another thing is I've seen these videos on YouTube where they'll take like a scene from a, you know, like How I Met Your Mother, or they'll take a scene from Friends or something and they'll remove the laugh track. And how awkward everything feels because they just kind of like say weird things and then look at each other.
Yep.
Because you're waiting for the laugh track to finish.
Yep.
That's how a lot of this feels in the show sometimes, where it's just they'll say something really odd and then eerie silence. The laugh track is gone. Not that Twin Peaks ever had a laugh track, but it did have the music. It would have that punctuate scenes. So that is a curiosity. I will mention also on the casting for Bill Hastings, this is an actor who some viewers may recognize either from Scream or from Scooby-Doo.
Oh?
Because this is Shaggy, i.e.
Shaggy from Scream?
Shaggy from Scream, yes, and the killer from Scooby-Doo.
Wait a second. Okay, so spoiler alert for Scream.
I already spoiled it.
No. Spoiler alert for Scream. There's 2 killers. Which one was it?
He's the jokier, funny one.
Oh, the one that's like absolutely unhinged?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's beautiful.
Yeah. So he's that guy as well as plays Shaggy in the live action Scooby-Doo's. Matthew Lillard is the name of the actor.
Okay.
I think he's a great casting. And obviously we haven't... Bill Hastings is one character that I think if I tell you we're probably going to see more of him, it's not a shocker. He seems like he's being set up for a continuous storyline after part 2. How much? I can't say, but it doesn't seem like he's wrapped up. So I will say, I think he's a good casting. Even if a lot of the new characters I'm kind of just, about. I don't disparage the actor. I actually think his breakdowns and his emotions have been really interesting to watch.
I think so too. I think that, again, it has been good casting. However, I'm very curious on whether or not we're still going to get the dull drama tone with someone that I would associate with horror slapstick. If you've seen Scream, that like this guy gets ragged all over the damn place with Shaggy, literally one of the biggest comic reliefs.
I'll leave that casting to question mark in your mind if you think it might lead to something or not.
Thank you.
But as far as Bill goes, he seems super suspicious because even though he's denying all these things, there are gaps in his story. He basically, as he was talking, realized he couldn't account for like an hour and a half one night when normally he drives home, it wouldn't take that long. And it seemed like he genuinely did not know what was happening. And when it's pointed out, he's alarmed and then adds in some story about driving someone named Betty home. And it seems super like unusual the way he does it. Like, even the detective kind of looks at this like, okay, what is happening here? And he's clearly more distraught as he wants to keep bringing in his lawyer with the situation. And a lot of what's going on, tell me what's happening, which again, from a meta angle, I almost wonder if David Lynch is writing that because the viewers at this point are probably wondering, tell me what's going on, what's happening. David Lynch, I don't even know the context. Please tell me what the situation is so I know how to feel. I think Bill's interrogation feels like the audience may be being interrogated in that similar way. The other thing that I want to highlight that I think Matthew Lillard's performance well illustrates with this character is there's a way he interacts with Phyllis when she's finally brought over to see him and visit him at the prison. He kind of like looks her over and feels her body in a way that it's like he's checking to see if she's real. Like that's the distinct sense that I got while watching this, that he's like grasping onto her shoulders, like patting her shoulders and kind of looking her up and down in a way that felt very much like, is what I'm experiencing right now real? Which gets more context potentially later when Mr. She, yeah, Mr. She, Mr. She, fire the cannons. Peter Pan is nearby. But Mr. C shoots her after saying, you imitate human behavior perfectly, which makes it seem like she wasn't human. No, there's an effect that happens when he shoots her.
Okay.
Did you not see that?
I did not.
Okay, next time you get a chance, rewatch the way that when he shoots her, you can pause it and go frame by frame to confirm this. The screen distorts, it kind of wobbles a bit, and then it looks like a second version, semi-transparent of her, is next to her and flies off screen to the top right.
That's funny.
And that's not a spoiler, that is in the episode, but you can tell if you're watching closely when he shoots her, she glitches. Something happens when he shoots her.
I saw the burnt man whose head flies off into the distance, but it was specifically her overall alternative form. Again, it's really dependent on whether or not, like, yes, there is some form of, like, doppel sitting in another person's form. What is it, just another element of personality, which only, like, this overall entity once from the lodge can see? There's many questions I have. I took you imitate human behavior well less into that sense, and more so to emphasize the very deceptive nature of this woman, if you will, how she's able to smile and nod to overall situations.
She's being fake.
But she is being fake. So I took it as that sort of end, and I still lean to Mr. C seeing things other people can't see and maybe comment
his
upon them.
Involvement here is also curious, too, because time and place, when is he there? Like, in terms of when he's with Daria, is this before or after? Anyway, there's that. And then also, like, if he knows Phyllis this way and can enter the house, and she even, like, remarks, like, she seems aware of who he is and isn't startled that he's in her, like, she's surprised he's there, but not in the way like a random stranger's in your house. It's like, why are you here? What are you doing here in my house? That tone implies that they have a history of some kind. Did he pay her? Is he hiring her?
If it's
Is he to me, it reads as I'm cleaning up evidence. Like I'm getting rid of her now.
Let's take Mr. C, okay? Let's take Mr. C, the idea of doppelganger, and the idea of Bob and this overall fusion. Every instance that we've seen Bob kill inside of the past deals with a form of a relationship that is heavily influenced by some form of darker nature, oftentimes by a form of cheating, a form of deception, and a form of sort of like mystical sort of influences playing in the background, if you will, in these dreamlike natures. And that seems to fit overall this life very well. Bob once said, I will kill again. If 25 years later, maybe things have changed, but I'm taking it from Mr. C's choice of lifestyle that murder isn't something that he's too afraid of
I
doing.
would argue he spends more day killing people than days where there's no killing. It feels like if he doesn't kill someone, it's an off day.
He probably kills more than like he usually has breakfast on his mornings. Like,
yeah.
is it
Sometimes
like
he remembers to have breakfast, but he usually remembers to kill someone. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Best part of waking up is a bullet in your gun.
Oh, no!
Anyway, I'm not sponsored. Oh man, and there's also going back to the prison. There is that weird, charcoal of a man, right? They're sitting, a woodsman kind of figure, right?
Yep.
Just sitting in the prison cell, whose like head floats away.
I loved that moment where we were a chance. Like, there's a few, like we try to make time for each other to overall see this, but we made a special time to make sure that you and I were there for the first viewing, the first sitting. And I will probably always remember the moment where I'm just sitting back and like trying to gain what's happening in the situation as this overall strange charcoal man stares right back at us. Head flows like, oh, okay, bye.
What do you think was the
Goodbye.
intent? What's the intent of that?
He clicked his charcoal heels 3 times.
Because
like,
on one hand, I think it is funny.
Yeah.
Is the intent of that scene, is it supposed to be funny?
I think that.
Or is it supposed to be uneasy and scary and what is it supposed to do? If we're arguing intent.
I mean, to say that someone who lurks in this overall place, inside of this overall prison, stuck in this overall silence, to say that they lose their head, maybe this is just a very visceral sort of like experience of showing someone literally losing their head inside of this place. Like, that is what is a doomed result as of being inside this point of establishment. I do believe that it heavily leans into the sense of metaphor, but also somewhat kind of lurks in that realm between horror and comedy.
Well, the idea of losing your head has already been a thing with obviously Phyllis's head being dismembered from the body, who also lost the head. But then you also have the weird head of the evolution of the arm. There is a recurring idea of the decapitation.
There is, but this is specifically in this specific place, if
right.
you will.
I guess I view it more as linking what's happening right now with Bill Hastings to the supernatural. So to me, I read this as there's something strange in the neighborhood. Who are we going to call?
Someone else.
Someone else. Please call for help. That is all we can really say right now. Last thing I want to really mention with the South Dakota plot line is that when they go through the trunk and they find what looks like a piece of flesh of some kind in the trunk.
Yeah, it wasn't like a wolf ear or something like that?
No, it was just flesh of some kind. The guy goes woof in response, the detective Dave, which you can interpret why he goes woof.
That's probably why I thought wolf ear.
But his flashlight keeps flashing on and off. And if we're going with parallels between this investigation and what happened with Laura,
the transformer
in the pilot flickering on and off. So there's the angle of parallels, but there's also the angle of electricity is being affected. Yes, sir.
Oh, when's Phillip Gerard just going to be standing right next to these cops and saying like, "There's something wrong with your flashlight"?
I don't know. I think it is interesting that it's drawing that many parallels, because I think the flashlight going on and off is too on the nose of a parallel to not be part of this. I can't imagine David Lynch putting a light going on and off, on and off, on and off, and not thinking of the autopsy room in the pilot. That just feels too on the nose, right? Right?
It's most certainly...
Like, it's improbable.
It's most certainly improbable.
It's possible, but improbable.
Possible. Yes. So we got a mystery with a bit of random flesh inside the trunk. While we talk a little bit less about Mr. E and talk more about Mr. C, you got what I'm saying? You got what I dig?
Do you think that's on purpose? Mr. E, Mr. C? At this point, I would be inclined to say no.
You're inclined to say no? Okay, how come you say no? I think it's too far apart from it. I think it's just a coincidence at this point.
I think it's just because you have to differentiate the two different Coopers. This is a way to do it pretty quickly.
Yeah. But what?
I don't think it's supposed to be.
Why isn't it Mr. DC?
Because that'd be Washington, D.C.? I don't know. Like, that'd be even more. Who does that? I don't know. I don't know, man. But we get the scene with Mr. C. I think it's such a strong establishing scene.
It's something where there is a heavy, before the character even is on the string, there's this heavy, anti-authority song that says, before I take any orders from any of the men, to show, this overall, force of nature as it's, slow, the music is almost, slow down in the background.
It's a very slow remix, very percussive.
Very, very heavily percussive, as you just are only
to the point where the drums sound like gunshots. That's the level of percussive they're going for, with a nighttime driving scene, and I love my some nighttime visuals.
It really does. Again, if there's one thing the first episode does for both positive and negative, it cones your focus.
The black dog runs at night, baby. But no, I think that the music being played, the lyrics that are being played, even the song almost cuts off in a way where it's I can't remember the way it's worded exactly, but it's do I look like a, and then it's bang, 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 and then the song ends. So it doesn't even finish. There's something disjointed and off about it, which even makes it better, I think, in this situation. I don't know. It's so great. Song ends. Mr. C disarms the guard like it's just an everyday occurrence.
Oh, not disarms.
He folds this man.
He folds this man. This man is a chair now.
And I want to give, again, credit. We haven't seen Dale Cooper do a lot yet at this point, and I won't say more of where that goes, but what he's doing with Mr. C, Kyle MacLachlan deserves a lot of acting credit.
Yes.
I feel like this is so far the performance of the show. It's the best performance in the show so far.
Yes.
With the most interesting character.
Yes.
And it matters so much because we're so used to what Dale Cooper is like. Even with the pilot being kind of weird, and even with Doppelcoop being kind of weird in season 2.
This is not a Frank situation. This is not a sort of any bad boy situation that Lynch has put through. Is very much lifted high on a pedestal for the sake of, this is not the person you knew once before. It carries the same form, but by the gods is he a force of nature.
I wanna make a comment here. It reminds me of this Onion. I think it's Onion. The Onion website did an article where it's talking about dating the bad boys versus the bad man. That's what I'm thinking of here. This is the bad man. Genre, no, and he's a bad boy. This is the bad man.
This is a bad man.
You do not want someone like this in your life.
There is no one inside of Twin Peaks that feels more threatening than Mr. C.
I think it's so important for this to work, though, because, again, we have all the ideas of what Dale Cooper is like, and somehow Kyle MacLachlan, even just from his face, I don't know. There's makeup being done to make him look greasier. And there's obviously the stuff with the hair. I almost want to say his eyes have been darkened or something in the pupils. But even just the way he looks, I don't see Cooper. And that's incredible. How do I not see Cooper looking at this man? But I don't. I don't see him as the same character just from a physical transformation side of things. Let alone the way he speaks, his cadence, his deliveries. It's also very different than Jeffrey in Blue Velvet. Very different from when he played in Dune. Because I'm used to seeing him in those kinds of roles. And I've seen the version of Hamlet that he was in, where he was Claudius. He was the murderous Uncle Scar king killer. He wasn't that menacing as Claudius either. He was more of an intellectual. I have never seen Kyle MacLachlan play this type of character to this degree. Even when he does play villain roles in films, I haven't seen him do this. Which I don't know. I think David Lynch knew exactly what to tap into with him, and Kyle MacLachlan knew how to respond to it. And I mentioned this is someone you don't want in your life. In the scene we get randomly in Las Vegas, again, the only scene we've got in Las Vegas so far, we get someone named Mr. Todd, who's the same actor who was the one having that dream at Winky's.
Yes.
He was the one that turned the corner and something scared him there. Okay, that actor plays someone named Mr. Todd, who talks to this guy named Roger, seems like an intern or something. And Roger is just why do you let him order you like this? Why do you do this? And Mr. Todd says, you better hope that you never get involved with anyone like him. Never have someone like him in your life. And it does hearken to mind how a lot of David Lynch films have that figure. You have your Frank Booths. You have your mystery man from Lost Highway.
Yes.
You have Willem Dafoe's character in Wild at Heart, as well as Grace Zabrisky's character even from Wild at Heart. You've got these, or the Mafia in Mulholland Drive. You have these dangerous people. I think the closest comparison might be the Mafia in Mulholland Drive, but Mr. C is like a one-man mafia. He does all of these things that like these shadowy groups can do in these other movies. I want to, again, praise where praise is worthy, that I think Mr. C might be just immediately my favorite David Lynch antagonist.
Mm-hmm.
In only 2 parts.
No, I agree at this point. Like, I absolutely agree.
And to take that from a guy who plays Dale Cooper, who normally is like, I like trees. to take that. We've seen Cold Cooper, but this is something else.
I think for the most part, that's just because there's, at the very least, a form of showmanship here and there. Something in which, like, the characters, when they act malevolently, there's either a twirly nature to it, there's a fun to it, and even if that not, there's at least a form of a professional business. This person's form of business is that if he doesn't get what he wants, like, it's going to be pushed, it will be bulldozed.
And like Frank and Willem Dafoe's character, they had people with them who like were cronies who like laughed at their jokes and had a good time with them.
I don't see anyone having a good time with
Mr.
Cooper.
C doesn't even seem like he's having a good time. He's having a bad time and enjoying that. Like, there's something different here. Anyway, Mr. C dismantles and folds around like a origami this man at the door. Obviously, then later tells the owner of this shack, Beulah, you need to get something better for your security.
Yeah.
And she makes this reply, it's a world of truck drivers. Do you attach any sort of interpretation or meaning to the phrase, it's a world full of truck drivers? Because I think truck driver, think of Leo Johnson, right? So I think of the Twin Peaks. So it seems that was a reply to the idea that the bad help that she got at the door is a world full of truck drivers. I don't know what to mean of this.
I think that's just in the larger sense of it, people come and people go. It's something in which like that position is something that can be refilled, but at the same time, the reliability is shaky at best.
Is that how truck drivers are?
Not that they're
the Unplugged Professor gives his report on the idea of truck drivers.
No, it's because truck drivers are always on the move. They come and they go, if you will. It's just something that is supposed to tailor the experience to potentially a more emotional response, if you will, especially with the overall style of livings that it seems that they are currently living in which it seems that it is mostly people who are more, I would say, hardy in their overall natures, people who are more so set into their overall ways inside this little corner. And there are individuals that I know who are similar to that are also paralleled with the truck driver, if you will. Stereotype, absolutely, but on the same token, it's something of a shorthand for a dialogue that you think that this character relates to. It believes in the metaphor truly, as Otis sits before her drinking out of a yellow mason jar, at first thinking that it might be piss for me, and actually may just be pickle juice, because there's also a pickle jar there.
Well, it's full. There's no pickle jar. There's a jar full of potatoes.
Oh, but it's potatoes. Pickled potatoes.
They don't look like pickles. They look like potatoes.
There's a yellow liquid around them.
Yeah, they're like potato brine.
Pickled potato.
Which, I don't know about you, but when I'm thirsty, I don't crave potato water.
Oh, sweet, sweet, delicious potato water.
It is strange. I think this environment is even more than the glass box room, very reminiscent of the Red Room. And there's enough things that are being done here where it like leads you to wonder, at least for myself. I say you, but I mean me. It leads me to wonder if this is somehow, again, connected to the Red Room in some way, because you have no lines from these two, but in the room, just kind of off in the other side of the room, there's these two people sitting,
One larger, one shorter.
One with short limbs, one with long limbs. And it's obvious you could draw parallels here.
Yes.
And Beulah herself, you can't quite tell what her energy and what her vibe is. This place, given Mr. C's involvement, gives a bad vibe. But then also you have the idea here that this is how he gets Ray and Daria. And we find out later that Ray and Daria appear to be double agents, basically. That they are working with Mr. C, and maybe have for a while. Maybe he's had them work with him before, because he knows him by name. But they're also betraying him at this moment and working for someone who may be Phillip Jeffries.
Yes.
So,
someone with apparently a lot of money.
So this seems to be a place you go when you need to get something done discreetly, no questions asked. But there are certain, repeat customers that Mr. C seems to know Ray and Daria from maybe past encounters. I don't know. What do you make of Beulah's shack? Do you think there's like some spiritual Red Room stuff going on here? Is it just a coincidence? Why include those two people in the background?
I think that there's most certainly parallels, just to remind you of the general environment, but I think most of all, this is just set up for the type of lifestyle that Mr. C is willing to delve into, if you will, in which it's something where there's a quiet shack being guarded by someone with a gun, in which it seems there's a shady goings-on, in which it seems a form of operatives, in this case, two individuals that might be involved in Beulah's overall family, or like something that involves with Beulah. But regardless, this is not something that is above the table. This is very, very, very beneath the table, underneath the overall floorboards, underground. And it's just an excellent introduction overall to Cooper in general. I think that if you had...
C.
Thank you, Mr. C. I think that...
Who I guess is also Cooper, but...
Yeah, no, but it's good to distinguish.
Differentiate.
It's something that if I could ever think of a way to introduce Mr. C onto the table, if you will, this was the way to do it. It's just that there's familiar things in the background, likely following Mr. C around any angle, and you can almost imagine maybe Mr. C sees himself as a potential reminder of what he may be potentially up against.
Right, that he's about to go back to the Red Room if he doesn't do something.
Yeah, seeing
he
these
seems to have a
parallels in
plan.
life.
He's very confident he has a plan to deal with this.
Or at the very least, he doesn't give off any emotion to show anything that lacks confidence.
That's very
but
true.
More so, again, a force of nature. It's not that he needs something, he wants something.
Then we get another familiar environment when he goes to a diner. What diner is this? I don't think it's ever stated. And considering that he accesses the Phyllis household, the Hastings household, we can assume he's in South Dakota right now, maybe?
Maybe.
Or else he's on transit to South Dakota.
He's on the road, likely heading to
Yeah.
a location, to an overall diner. It's
If
something
these
that you
events
can
line
access.
up that way.
Yes, it's something you can access at any hour of the day. So, which diners are heavily useful for the
Yeah.
sake of like being there about 2 or 3 in the morning if you're at a Denny's or a Perkins.
This is where we get that line of, I don't need anything, Ray. If there's one thing you should know about me, Ray, it's that I don't need anything. I want. And I want that information.
Such a good line. It's where like Ray's
so good.
It's where Ray is stepping out of bounds for Mr. C, where it seems like Ray's almost sort of like nudging Mr. C, like testing his limits.
He is definitely playing with him. Even the first line we get at a Ray at the diner, one of the first lines, he's joking about how, Jack, you've hardly touched your 3 dinners. Like, he's just kind of this joking, easygoing kind of mood, talking with him. And we see that immediate pushback. And there's tension right away, even as they're talking about the stuff with Mr. Hastings. There's clear tension between Mr. C and Ray. There's clear distrust, which we find out is vindicated in the sense that Ray is playing both sides.
Why is she only willing to talk to you, Ray? As Mr. C would kind of press against him.
And I should clarify, we don't know that Ray's playing both sides. We just know that he's for sure playing Mr. C. Whether he is actually on the Jeffries side or not, we don't know. I shouldn't say it in a way that's not clear right now.
He is either on Ray's side or he is on Mr. C's side, depending on the hour
I don't think
of
he's
the
on
day.
Mr. C's side.
He's on Mr. C's side superficially.
I think he's either on Ray's side or Jeffries' side. I think it's pretty clear at this point he's not on Mr. C's side.
Yes, what I'm getting as superficially. On paper, he's on Mr. C's side until he can tear up that paper, throw it in Mr. C's face, and do a victory. Because that's what he's playing off in this diner, being like, yeah, no, I'm the only one that can do this overall situation. You just gotta trust me onto this, as he sort of like does a half-cocked grin.
Yeah, Mr. C doesn't trust people, I don't think.
I don't think you should ever trust anyone like
that.
Ray in general.
Yeah, and also Daria says nothing during the diner scene, which I thought was interesting. I don't know if Jack says anything either.
Jack does not say anything.
I don't even know
here.
what Jack is.
Jack is probably someone who has to like deal with some of the auto works nearby, just because we see him put like a secretary's car away, if you will.
Because we see Mr. C massage Jack's face for an uncomfortable amount of time. Granted, the way he's doing it is uncomfortable in any situation, any amount of time.
Yes, he puts it onto his face. Just as a spoiler, Mr. C claims that he kills Jack. But one thing that I was half hoping for, seeing the other like body mutilations earlier on, I was hoping to make the one-eyed Jack reference. I thought he'd shoot him in the face, and then he'd have the one eye, and then, oh, look, it's one-eyed Jack's! Ha 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 ha! But no, that did not happen.
No
It's very
penis
cool. No, instead
references.
just rubbed his face for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, all I get is the sense of power and domination out of that scene. He's like, these people are Play-Doh to him. I don't... Do you get any other readings beyond that?
Intimidation, a feeling of the familiar before a potential loss that might be at hand for him going ahead. Something that overall he's just taking in every bit of his environment, because in truth, the real world seems far more physically tangible than the Red Room or anything like that. It could be a lot of things. There could be a lot of quirks that have developed with Mr. C. This is just one of the weirder ones we found.
Yeah. And Daria's attempt to like hide what's going on falls apart catastrophically.
Yep.
Because when he enters, she quickly ends a phone call, and he's like, yeah, who are you talking to? Oh, I was talking to Jack. And then, like, 5 minutes pass, he's like, oh, by the way, I killed Jack. Like, there's no way you were talking to Jack. By the way, can we listen to the phone call you just had that was not with Jack?
The lead up here, though, is so great because, like, as he just, like, brings in, he's already, like, got all the cards inside of his overall pocket. At this point, he is just, like, very clearly looking through both of the windows. He's moving around the area and even asks Daria, hey, where's your gun?
Yeah.
Like, where's your 45? It's like, oh, yeah, it's right over here. And, like, Daria is trying to comply because she feels like, oh, yes, if I ever, like, show anything that would be distrust, that would just be too off-putting, and that would cause issues.
And meanwhile, the vulnerability she's in is further accentuated by the fact that she is lying there in lingerie.
Yes.
So, like, she is unclothed, vulnerable, in the bed of this guy who is completely dominating this situation and has all the power and all the cards.
He literally ends up grappling her shortly after revealing that Jack is dead. Whenever there's a point where she speaks up too far, he ends up like full on decking her to silence her. And during this whole time, there's no raise of voice. There is no intensity of emotion. Cooper's already got everything. Mr. C has everything already planned out. Mr. C is making sure that everything is in play. And Mr. C is not hiding anything from Daria. Are you going to kill me? It's not even playing. It's like, yes, I will. And Daria, even at one point where she's like giving more information, where she's just like, yeah, no, like this, like it was going to be between me and Ray. We get to split the money. I don't know the identity of who would have that money. And even like, well, Mr. C is like making emphasis, like, were you given any coordinates? And makes emphasis on like details in the coordinates. And he says, this could save your life. Daria simply says no. And that's at that point, Mr. C coldly, quickly, and with calculation, basically decks her, smothers her with a pillow, muffles the gunshot with the pillow, and
he doesn't make a song and dance of it the way that Leland would when killing Maddie, or even killing Laura for that matter. It isn't portrayed as like him enjoying the suffering.
It's not.
He just does it.
It's not even him struggling to cause the suffering or anything. He just does it. I can see, say for example, the yellings of Frank, if you will, the snickering of the one individual from the Nicolas Cage film, which is no Wild at Heart. There we go. I forget that little guy's name. The Smarty guy. There's no inclination of any emotion other than I'm doing something that needs to be done.
This is where I think, even though we haven't got a lot, there's still enough to explore with this character, because I think it's really tempting to... I'm just going to go off for a second. So
Go for it.
It's really tempting to look at this as the anti-Cooper. And I don't think that's the case from what we've seen so far. I think it more is the growth 25 years later of the most negative traits that were already in Dale Cooper.
If the arm can evolve, who is to say the doppelganger?
We can all grow and change. What an inspirational message. If you just tap into all of your darkest... Anyway, but no, I think it's not anti-Cooper in the sense that I think that there is still Cooper there.
Yeah.
And in a weird way, and we talked about the synthesis of Bob with Cooper. Bob seems to be the one who enjoys suffering, the one who makes a song and dance of it to some extent, by the way that Mike would speak of him, saying that it was like his children, the suffering and the joy.
Mind you, the time in which we do see the enjoyment of suffering, and we see suffering as a potential transactional thing, such as with Fire Walk With Me, he throws the overall pain and suffering, aka the Garmin Bosia, right before the arm, Mike,
Yes.
however you want to interpret it. Is it a question of whether or not he enjoys it because of that transactional nature, and maybe either debts are repaid or debts are now being put off to the side? What reasons does he seek out Garmin Bosia at that point?
Well, I want to go a step further and say that I think that you could read, at least at the moment, this is kind of where I'm at right now with what we're given, is Bob may have enjoyed most of all the suffering of Leland, and being able to feed off of Leland's suffering because some part of Leland knew it and was denying it, and that was the juiciest, most succulent corn. Whereas, if we look at the synthesis of the worst parts of Cooper, there isn't necessarily that hesitance, there isn't that regret, there isn't that guilt. There is such a coldness that I think it's tempting at this point to say that even though they may have merged, it also could be looked at that Cooper might have domesticated Bob, that Cooper might have dragged Bob down to that point, and Cooper's more in control, because I see from this the cold Cooper drawn to the extreme from that pilot.
Actually, you make a good point here, because let's look at something such as Leland. Leland is someone that we've seen multiple points is a very emotional father. He's someone that's very tall and presentery whenever it comes to things, but at his core is someone who is very sad, someone who is very in touch with his overall emotions, that he's willing to fall into them. He's willing to fling up and sing a song, but also cry buckets of tears when it comes to the loss of Laura. I think that also his overall past with something such as the Access Guide, seeing that he was part of about the players of theatrics and so on, even if it had to be a face, he knows how to physically tap into those emotions. Cooper is not he experiences emotions, but mostly in his own sort of reserved analytical sort of sees the world.
Intuition is his biggest trait.
Exactly. If you take all the emotional aspects that we see familiar with Leland, then what does Bob play with then? What does Bob emphasize? What is Bob other than an emphasis of one's overall being, spirit, and then playing off of those boundaries?
Because if you want to do the most amount of harm, Leland is not that. Leland is a family man who inflicts suffering upon his family and Teresa Banks.
Yes.
It's a pretty small pool, and if we assume that he was with Leland since Pearl Lakes when Leland was a child, that's more than 25 years he was with Leland. And the death count is 4? Maybe. If you count Mr. C, even just from what we've seen so far in 2 parts, it seems like this guy is doing way more damage and way more, dark acts on a daily basis than Leland.
It's something it's what he's capable of, which brings into the larger question between these emotional individuals that Bob has inflicted inside the past. Is it more that he's being domesticated, or more so that there's more to realize on what Bob is beyond those surfaces, if you will, this overall leech-like figure that is already preying on the most probably vulnerable parts of an overall human psyche and then pushing that to limits? If that's the case, what is Bob's goal when being Mr. C, or what was the intended goal initially?
Right. This is where things get into speculation that I love. I enjoy this. But given what we saw of the doppelganger in Season 2's finale being so different personality-wise, it's hard to really know, what did Doppelganger Coop see in the situation? What did Bob see in the situation? Did either of them get what they want? Did those goals change over 25 years? Who's more in control? Are they even separate anymore? These are all fun things to play with, and I find them enjoyable mysteries.
Agreed.
I think that they're fun to watch, and I think that the biggest takeaway I would have as far as making it more concrete is that the type of interaction Bob and Leland had, this sort of feeding off of the misery that Leland had and the guilt and the repression, I don't sense that at all with Mr. C, because Mr. C right now doesn't have a face of Leland happening. Mr. C in every interaction is not hiding anything of who he is. So I don't think that Bob would have a good time out of feeling the guilt. Instead, it's almost the opposite, which is where I think all the speculation comes from, regardless of what the answer may in fact be.
Okay.
Where I'm more convinced it's Cooper in control, and where I still see a side of Cooper, even if, grossly perverted, is his reaction to finding out about Phillip Jeffries. Because he says he has a plan to deal with the Black Lodge and now to not get put back in there.
Yeah.
But when he finds out that Ray and Daria are betraying him, when he's kind of wondering about Jeffries, he makes the comment that this is a game. And he seems to perk up with a bit of interest. Now, granted, it's not it's not an overflowing of emotion the way that you get with Windham Earl.
But at the same time,
it's way different than what we had so far.
It's way different, but there's still, I would even argue, at the very least by the tone of an idea of a game, the thoughts of Windham Earl are easy to spark up.
And that's what I find so interesting, is that there's that part of Cooper that likes the game, that likes the hunt. And it's the same way that I think that Dale Cooper in the pilot enjoyed toying with Bobby. Right? I think it's that intellectual battle that also fulfills Cooper with the chess match against Windham Earl. Yes, mostly Cooper is concerned with the truth, with justice, with saving people. Absolutely, that's the main thing. But do I think there's a base part of Cooper that gets a kick out of the actual fight itself? Absolutely, I do. I think he wants to be the hero and fight. And I think that this puzzle, this game, perks him up a little bit.
And also, I would argue, what if this overall impish being and or Bob-like being is very similar to, say, for example, Windham Earl in the respects of, like, the promise of a game? Like, we could also attribute that similar to potential lodge spirits that exist within the overall mortal body that's compelled to overall return and or deal with this place. Again, like, that's the big thing. The return. Windham Earl returned to the lodge, chose the means of the return, accepted a means of a return, if we are to assume that that's the reason why he wants to access the lodge in the first place, that he's going back. This Bob Coop...
Well, Windham Earl, it seemed like, wanted to harness the power of darkness. Like, he wanted to be a Dugpa.
It seemed to be.
Yeah.
Yes, but remember, he was involved himself with Dugpas, and I would argue the footage of him still was emotionally different and almost distant between what we saw of Windham Earl then. What's the difference between Windham Earl in the past? What is the present? Because we didn't get as much personal with Windham Earl in the respects as we do with Cooper and Mr. C. If it's something where, like, one has to return after an allotted period of time, whatever that time is, whatever variables those times are, and the fact that Windham Earl is willingly approaching the lodge as opposed towards Mr. C trying to potentially avoid the lodge, there's a fun banter one can overall play with these overall choices.
We get a couple more clues, or at least puzzle pieces to play around with in the conversation here, where Mr. C asked Daria if Ray had mentioned anything about coordinates, about geographical locations.
Yes.
Unclear at this time, unless I'm mistaking something. I think right now it's unclear if Mr. C has those already and doesn't want someone else to have them, or if he is looking for those coordinates as well. Has that been clear?
Not clear yet.
He just is wondering if those are brought up. Okay.
Yeah, which makes sense because coordinates overall, the location of items, especially whenever it comes to the specific place of Glastonbury Grove and how coordinates were found with Windham Earl.
So we don't know if Mr. C has those or is looking for them as well. He does say something specific that he does want.
Or to confirm them.
Yes, or to confirm them. He does say something he does want, though, and he shows Daria this card. How would you describe what's on that card?
I'm looking at the exact image from the card right behind you. It's clearly a nice little, like, if it had arms, it would be widely putting them out in a nice little Y shape as if to accept a hug with two little yellow beady eyes and little antennas because the famous series Kingdom Hearts has released a plush of these little, what are they called?
Shadow.
Shadow.
Well, it's a Heartless is the name of the creature, and that's a shadow. I have a plush of this thing in my living room here.
It's literally right there.
It's right across from him. The point is, it reminds you of that image. Now, clearly, it's not a Kingdom Hearts reference in this show.
But are you saying that him seeking out something heartless wouldn't be something
ignoring
fun?
That? It's a fun layer of ignoring that.
We're tapping into the fact that David Lynch may be playing video games like Silent Hill and Kingdom Hearts.
What do you think?
His two favorite games.
What do you think it actually is? Because it's like a black circle with what looks like two antennae.
Right now, it looks like a strange overall impish, I would say, figure, but mostly just because the obscured absolute darkness of it, kind of like.
Is that the wood? Is that the wood tick hiding in the log?
It could be a wood tick. It could be the head of an ant. It's something that is, I would say, likely minuscule as well as dark.
Yes. Also, note there's a bunch of scratches above and below the card, and it is an ace of spades. Do you do anything with those things?
Grab your shovel.
Okay. Well, we do see a character with a shovel here, so we can maybe tie that in.
Bunch of shovels.
We can maybe tie that in there.
He's the four of spades.
And then Mr. C has a bunch of devices here. He hooks up this device, and a red light comes on, and he talks to someone named Phillip, and as the conversation goes on, it is supposed to be Phillip Jeffries, but this is a curious encounter.
Phillip Jeffries?
Because the Phillip Jeffries we know and obviously love is from Fire Walk With Me. And, that character is played by David Bowie with a ridiculous accent. With a ridiculous, like, Southern accent, right? And when Phillip talks, he sounds closer to the archivist than he does Southern David Bowie.
Voices through electricity can sound drastically different, especially if you add 25 years, maybe lose the accent. But could this be a separate Phillip Jeffries, the same Phillip Jeffries? Because last time we saw Phillip Jeffries, he couldn't stay still in one place. He kept on going off on vacation off in a tropical island and came back to the overall office. He just doesn't know how to take a day off. Oh, wait, no, it's the magical teleportation stuff going on with him.
Well, what seems especially suspicious is that Mr. C, even in the conversation, is like, are you really Phillip Jeffries.
Which is funny because when talking about things such as the Black Lodge, like the first Philip we think of is probably like Philip Gerard, if you will.
Right.
But which Philip is it until emphasized as Phillip Jeffries?
I think that's playing with the audience.
Yep.
I think David Lynch plays with the audience. I don't think that means he's spiteful all the time, but I think he's definitely playing with the audience here.
And whoever this entity is assuring Cooper that he will return to the lodge tomorrow. And he, in a way, seems to potentially be playing with Cooper, if you will. Well, not Cooper,
With
Mr. C.
Well,
One
he
day I'll
also
get it.
says he met up with Garland Briggs.
Yeah, how did you know that?
So
There's what, like,
yeah, right,
Mr.
right.
C asks.
So you get this weird, we don't know where it's going yet, but someone who says they're Phillip Jeffries, but may not be Phillip Jeffries, who doesn't sound like Phillip Jeffries, says that they recently talked to Garland Briggs. And by the way, I'm just calling to say goodbye, Mr. C, because you're going to go back in the lodge. And then supposedly whoever this voice belongs to
Through electricity.
will be back with Bob again.
Through electricity.
Well, like the last person who's with Bob is Leland. But that doesn't sound like Leland over the call.
Yeah, but remember one person who is very connected to Bob, if you will, that also is connected to a Philip, Mike.
So you think that sounds like Mike?
I think that this could lean a bit either.
It doesn't sound like the same voice.
It doesn't need to. It needs to be electricity.
Yeah.
The fact is that, but that's
I
the
get
big
what
thing.
you mean, but I'm just laughing at your word.
The communication through electricity doesn't have to sound like it. In fact, like it having that chance to overall warp in voice, and the fact that like we literally have Mike in two different parts as two different voices, the arm as well as through Phillip Jeffries in that little deep tone. Who's to say that he doesn't even have even more voices or like a combined voice that could be overall recognized by someone such as Bob?
So a big mystery right now.
Big mystery.
For sure. And Mr. C then logs into like an FBI website, screens like flickering out and
isn't
glitching.
that funny? Like, she's accesses the FBI website. Like, it does flicker and everything. I'm wondering if there's any sort of
Looks
like
like
mythical
hacking.
shenanigans.
I think we're saying hacking or the electricity element.
The electricity, and maybe a little bit of both. Like expert hacker Dale Cooper.
And presumably, again, if we're going by the end of Secret History, it's been like basically 25 years since he would have got access to all of the Listening Post alpha material, assuming Major Briggs didn't destroy it or move it or something.
Yes.
So we don't know right now, after the Mayday signal was launched, what did Major Briggs do? And this idea that Phillip Jeffries or whoever recently talked to Major Briggs, that makes it seem like, okay, well, Major Briggs wasn't killed by Cooper 25 years ago, at least. It's a lot of questions. And I have told you before that the actor who played Major Briggs had passed away,
Yes.
as well as David Bowie had passed away before they could be in the return.
Yes.
So that leads into more questions of how are they going to be represented, if at all, in this work. Questions upon questions.
More trees.
We see Mr. C go toward the next door, who apparently were people he knew, called Chantal and Hutch.
Yes, Chantal.
A married couple.
A married couple. Apparently, like, Hutch is someone that Chantal can contact and so on, but she is staying at this hotel, in which, let's just say, it's very easy and clear to see the sexual
Dynamics.
dynamics that we have between her as well as Mr. C.
I also like, again, how Mr. C is so matter-of-fact and deliberate that even when he makes, like, dirty talk, it doesn't feel like flirty or sensual.
When literally he
It's an
is touching
observation.
her downstairs, it says, "You're wet."
It's like an observation. It's so good. And then we get Chantal, who's got a bit more personality. And there was like some snack food, and there wasn't like, was it Cheez-Its or what was it?
Oh yeah, delicious Cheez-Its. That's the main thing that I was wanting to bring up. So we know for a fact that there are Cheez-Its in the room. Thank you, listeners. Just know comfortably there were Cheez-Its in the room.
Well,
the greatest sponsorship deal of our time.
I would say it would be time to end the episode of the podcast on that note, but we haven't talked about the town of Twin Peaks yet.
And we won't. Goodbye, everybody.
Bum,
Da-da-da-da-da.
bum. That's Twin Peaks theme.
Is it?
I'm terrible with rhythm.
Oh, Canada.
Twin Peaks, da. So we get snapshots of things in Twin Peaks. The main thing is the police department, but we do get a few other snapshots. The first thing we get at Twin Peaks, although it seems like on the outside of the town, and one of the earliest things we get in the return is Lawrence Jacoby, who may or may not be a doctor anymore, so I'm just going to say Lawrence.
It looks like...
Can I call you Lawrence?
Oh, can I call you Lawrence?
Can I call you Larry?
Lawrence.
Larry's
Lawrence.
short for Lawrence,
Law.
Larry. Larry's short for Lawrence, right?
Good old LJ.
Good old LJ, who is living out in the woods, it seems, and receives a shipment of shovels.
Yep, a bunch of shovels, in which when he receives these shovels, if you will, which, by the way, great introduction. He's wearing something over his overall eyes, and he takes that off to reveal the little glasses underneath.
It's like what you wear if you're trying to, like, block the sun out, or, like, safety goggles that go over glasses.
Yes.
Such things do exist.
They do exist. It's just very humorous that that's the choice of things. Like, at first, it's like something unrecognizable, and then it's like,
well, if you want to really big brain this, right? He's wearing darkness over his eyes, and he is obscuring or protecting, the vision there. You could try to thematically read something out of it. And you did talk about the spades on the card being shovels, potentially. Do you get evil vibes from this Lawrence Larry Jacoby LJ?
I get the vibes that this guy has abandoned society. He's
off the grid.
He's off the grid. The only person who knows him on the grid is Shovel Man, who literally like comes up to him and like skips him his shovels, if you will, and he's like, I think he even like recognizes him still. He says Doc.
Okay, he does say Doc.
But he might recognize him as an old doctor and just carries
it's a nickname,
the name.
Potentially.
It could be a nickname, potentially. So he's like, hey, you need any help there, Doc? He's like, you know me. It's like, I like to do things myself.
So what do you think he's doing with these shovels?
Whoever needs multiple shovels, I don't
know. What's the most amount of shovels you've ever bought in one purchase?
One!
One, right?
A singular shovel is pretty good for me.
Yeah.
But apparently, like, Dr. Jacoby needs one for every day of the week, I guess.
Maybe he's like a groupie who follows Mr. C around and buries all the bodies. He just needs one shovel for every body. He can't reuse the same shovel twice. Obviously, that'd be wrong.
Like, maybe he's just trying to build a legacy for himself so that if Dr. Jacoby keels over any of these days, all that his legacy will show is the mystery of the man with the shovels surrounding his entire home.
So no theories?
He'll be the legend of the shovel man.
No theories at this time?
No theories at all. There's nothing really enough for me to theorize.
Do you think we're going to see any...
Okay, there's one, but that's like humorous. It's like, remember the old tale of like, we couldn't bury you deep enough?
Yes.
Maybe he's using the shovels like...
Bury Laura deep enough?
Keep burying Laura down.
He's been digging for 25 years.
And that's why he needs multiple shovels, because they keep breaking. Like, that's
Journey to the center of the earth,
away.
The molten rock he's encountering. That's a great theory. I love that. Considering Secret History gave us an ending to Lawrence, to the sense of that letter, and you seem to really thought it was a fitting ending, how do you feel seeing him back? Like, do you feel like, oh man, we ended him last time so good in the book, we shouldn't do this?
I don't think that... Here's the thing. That's the best ending for Dr. Lawrence Jacoby. The character can come back, but the story can be still finished. Like, I still do find that to be a good fitting end for the character of Dr. Jacoby. If he comes back in this capacity, either in an Elseworld story or a new story, at the end of the day, this is a different Dr. Jacoby. Not in the respect that it couldn't be the same person living the same life, but it looks like he is in a different stage in life, a different stage of person, different stage of being.
Okay.
That... This
arc is a new arc.
This is either a new arc or a not necessarily epilogue. What is like a died epilogue? You know,
what?
Like where you can hear a little bit more about the people, but at the same time, it's not being conclusive. It's just like saying, yeah, and this guy went off to do this
like
thing.
An afterward.
Afterward. There we go.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. We got the Brothers Horn over at the Great Northern Hotel. Still there, still at the same desk with the Big Ben-Hur style placard on the counter there.
Yeah, isn't this interesting? Overall, he's still working over at the Great Northern, if you will. He's discussing matters with one of the overall staff members, in which
Beverly,
in which he's just making sure that
apparently a skunk got into the Great Northern at some point.
And making sure people are being compensated, as well as making sure they're taken care of. But at the same time, will not let down from, say, for example, his version of events, where he says, no, that was not the case. There was not a skunk inside of her room. It was clearly off over here. Still, regardless, there's still a skunk enough in the area that seems to be causing problems. But still...
Oh, speaking of the smell of skunk, his brother should appear.
His brother appears and talks so vibrantly about delicious food, if you will, and how, like, he's ready to indulge into this piece of food.
Yeah, because of drugs.
Because of drugs, but at the same token, like... He's always been fond of overall food.
Yeah,
it's just that he's getting
from food to drugs,
but he's still enjoying food.
The drugs are in the. That's what he's talking about. Is the blend of drugs in the food?
Yeah, he's talking about the blend of drugs. Absolutely, it's still like his overall passion for food.
Yeah,
I'm saying
that's morphed.
It's something familiar and new with this overall character.
Instead of smoked pig, he's the smoker now.
He's the smoked pig.
He's the smoked pig.
But I do love this because it takes the familiar essence of this overall character and then spins it into something overall different, new. The most notable point of the dialogue is one. he is talking to Ben and saying like, oh, that's the new girl, or should I say new woman, and starts overall pushing that little sexualized nature of like,
have you banged her yet?
Yeah, it's like, oh, God, no, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, respect.
Also, she's married.
Which is Ben's reply, and that never stopped you before is what Jerry goes through. What this potentially implies is that something happened to Ben, either if you believe the events towards the end of the Twin Peaks.
You know what I'm going to ask you.
Yeah, I know what you're going to ask me. I'm going to keep moving forward.
Okay, I'll save my question for whenever you stop.
There's this Ben that's overall what seems to be pushing down this overall past that Jerry seems to keep trying to dig up, if you will. Just like, hey, you're my brother. I already know like how you are. Like whatever happened right here. And it's like, he's like, no, I can't do that. She's married. Like, I'm not going to try to advance towards that. This seems like a more calmed down, more reserved, a more focused Ben than we'd seen in the show. Like, we had our caution, we had our worries, we had our overall thoughts. Like, is this truly a changed Ben? And whether or not it was from that point, at the very least now, he's confiding in his brother. The one person you'd expect him to be completely honest to in a closed-off room space. The fact that he's not doing that shows that, at the very least, at this moment, Ben has changed. Like, Ben has changed since the beginning of Twin Peaks to this point that he's not trying to reach these advantages. He recognizes his overall feelings, emotions, as well as his lusts, but he knows his overall sense of trying to RESPCT that he holds it back. What's also notable, before we get to the question, is the fact that Ben is relieved that Jerry's not being involved as much with the hotel business, like he's put outside of the hotel game, but Jerry fights back saying, yeah, and I've tripled our revenues with my business.
Yeah, now that weed is legal in Washington state, he has managed to make more money off of his weed-related enterprises than Ben has made at the hotels.
He's the one who has been more fortunate with overall funds as opposed to Benjamin Horn, which is a fun overall power dynamic. But it's also playing with that odds and ends of like Ben trying to hold up to his respectful business, trying to make sure not to probably fall back into these overall old habits, and having this overall new outlook on life, while someone such as Jerry is thriving, which, forgive me if I'm speaking too soon, I'm not taking that Jerry has much RESPECT for anything but himself.
Okay. I won't say either way, obviously.
Oh, that's fine.
I do think it's an interesting parallel, given that Ben and Jerry had those interactions with the folks like Leo and Jean Renault, and were running drugs. So compare the underground illegal drug profits that Ben no doubt saw some fruition out of, versus Jerry profiting off of a legal enterprise. Yeah. That is interesting. Now, can I get to my question?
No, never.
I'm going
Go
to.
ahead.
So we got two different accounts of what happened according to the season 2 ending versus what the Secret History gave us. For those who didn't check out the Secret History or are kind of just tuning in right now, the Secret History of Twin Peaks very, very clearly states that Ben Horn had been planning secretly evil, bad things. Audrey's going to expose him at the bank. They were not on great terms, and Audrey was like calling her father out on it. And gradually over time, maybe Ben would change and get better, but at the end, he was still conniving and lying about the whole entire Operation Pine Weasel Ghostwood stuff. The show, on the other hand, while it never was super conclusive, it did walk the walk of showing Ben trying to tell the truth about Donna, and it never gave any indication that Audrey distrusted him, because when Audrey was at the bank, it seemed like she was going there with Ben's good graces, not out of some subterfuge. And we also talked about how, in the book, Benjamin Horn's situation with the Confederate War arc in season 2, in the book, I think it's a switcheroo of who surrenders, basically. So it seems like we're dealing with two different timelines. One where Ben Horn had X result from the Civil War and became truly reformed in a very sudden way, and was genuine about the Pine Weasel stuff and Ghostwood, or one that he was lying about the Pine Weasel stuff after a different Civil War arc. Which timeline, Ben, are you think we're dealing with here? Is it A, is it B, or is it a new one?
It's something where I'm feeling more to this is the Ben aligned with Twin Peaks from the show more than the book. But we've already went over. If you haven't experienced our 10-hour podcast over the secret history of Twin Peaks, our 10
probably
hours,
about that long, isn't it?
I added it up. It is over that long. I would say about 10 hours and 16 minutes.
We are so long-winded.
Regardless, there were so many suspicions using those timelines and seeing those overall differences, emphasize differences, these Elseworld differences, that I feel that pretty conclusively, like, that's the difference between, like, the Ben that we saw in the show versus the Ben that we see here. I think that the Ben inside the book, in a way that if you're paying attention while you're reading and seeing those overall differences, that Elseworld is showing when Ben goes into his worst and falls back into those poor habits, to emphasize that the Ben inside the show actually went into the good habits and was being genuine about it. Like,
So you think we're dealing with the show one?
we're dealing with the show one. I think that not only the book had confirmed those overall genuine benefits, but now it's even like reinforced by the just blatant dialogue that he has with his brother here. I think genuinely, if there was anyone that Ben would never deceive...
Genuinely. It's like genuinely, but it's genuinely.
It would be Jerry. I genuinely do not believe that Ben would deceive Jerry.
Also, how do you feel knowing that Jerry survived the cook from season 2?
It's clear because you see how thick his beard is. He went off into the woods and became a mad lumberjack man. He didn't do as well as Catherine when she secretly was out in the woods eating tuna fish. Something broke Jerry as he was constantly on the run from the cook. It's an arc I hope we can cover inside the Return.
The Secret Diary of Jerry Horn, to be published.
If only one day. That's one piece of Twin Peaks material I think we should have. We need to know the story of Jerry Horn and the cook.
So, most of the time we spend in Twin Peaks is at the police department. And one of our first encounters there is Lucy Brennan, having now taken Andy's last name, is at her usual desk, and someone enters asking to see Truman. And he's an insurance guy. He's an insurance guy asking to see Truman. Which one? And she says very, like, ominously, it could make a difference. It could make a difference.
Well, you see, one is sick and one is fishing.
So what do you make of that? Because at first you gave me some suggestions, and I wanted to see if you would change over time.
The first thing is that when they asked for Sheriff Truman, already one thing I would say that the position of sheriff was stolen away from Hawk. How dare they? Hawk.
I don't even need to state how much of an injustice it is that Hawk is not the sheriff 25 years later.
No, instead, it's either Sheriff Truman, in which the Truman that we do know, or a Sheriff Truman that we don't know, that... I imagine there might be a familial lineage that might lead into the position, in which, screw that, give Hawk the position.
So you think a son might have occurred?
Son, daughter, it could be something where maybe even a brother might be brought in. In any case, it seems like there's a familial relationship between these. I do think it's likely towards, if I had to guess, probably a younger individual.
So if you say brother...
Yeah.
Who are you referring to?
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you forget about the one Truman brother that's famous amongst the Bookhouse boys, which everyone knows and loves the name of?
Go on.
Because I did. I can't remember his name.
You made such a big deal. Okay, listeners, if you didn't go for that episode, he made such a freaking big deal about how the Secret History of Twin Peaks mentioned Truman had a brother who we never heard of before called Frank. Frank Truman. He's frankly true man. And we talked about this character, and the moment when because again, Professor and I were watching for the first time. He had never seen The Return before. We watched it together, and afterward, we were talking about all these things. I asked him about this moment. He did not bring up the idea of Frank Truman being the Truman, and I was stunned because of how fixated he was on Frank Truman. I thought for sure, the moment they said another Truman, you were going to latch onto Frank.
Who's to say, Kalil, I won't even give you this answer. Who's to say I haven't been holding on to this to see this reaction out of you in the podcast?
That'd make you a liar.
Okay, I'm a liar. Everyone, podcasters, I'm a liar.
I would much prefer you to be unflinching with the truth.
Of course. No, it's the truth. You already know the truth. You already know what's inside my head, and you know what I was not holding back.
Stop trying to, gaslight our audience. Listeners, if you feel that you've been gaslit by the Unplugged Professor, please email us.
I'm gaslighting you, excuse you. Not you, listener. I'm pointing at the Kalil.
Listener, we both know where he was pointing. You can email us at snakeeyedreams@gmail.com, or you can Twitter tweet us at snakeeyedreams1. That's the numeral 1, as in one finger was pointed in the wrong direction. Anyway, we got some situation where, like you were saying, either there is a different physical Truman, or you speculate the possibility that it's not a literal other person, but it might be like, if someone wants to see me, tell them I'm out fishing or something.
Oh, yes, basically. So it's
like
something
a funny lie kind of
like
situation.
a funny lie. It's like if anyone asks and I don't want to see, I'm out fishing. So it's the duality of Truman's, in which was overshot on Lucy's head, maybe?
What do you think is what is your current headcanon? Because presumably, unless the whole show goes with us never meeting
I believe
the
that
sheriff.
I believe that there's a second family Truman member.
Okay.
Genuinely, if you ever had to like shunt something into the future that far and either like play or hint at something such as that, this is a good introduction.
Yeah, Hawk should be the sheriff, though. Hawk should be the sheriff.
Hawk should be, but he's not.
Lucy is seen playing solitaire on the counter, or at least what I assume is solitaire based on the placement of the cards.
Definitely has a deck of cards.
Cards there. We also see cards in the room where Beulah's shack. I don't think there's a connection there. I just wanted to point out.
I think they both like cards.
They both like cards. I just read it as Lucy's doing something at her desk to keep herself busy while she's at work. Mm-hmm. And that's what she's doing. What is kind of funny, though, to me, is that solitaire, not that you can't play with cards, but she has a computer right in front of her, and I usually associate like solitaire on the computer these days. Mm-hmm. So like she could just play solitaire on her computer, but she instead has the cards on the table. Might indicate maybe something. Maybe.
With the history of One-Eyed Jacks with its overall card aesthetic, as well as just the already like continued usage of cards, especially with literally one card on Cooper's position, I imagine that like it's going to be a piece of physical material we're going to see pop up multiple times, either as a link to this overall larger game of 52 pickup, or if it's actually going to be something where there will be red herrings, where there will be certain leads, and it's just something to be generally cautious of, but still recognizable as a piece.
Do you think it makes
material.
Lucy suspicious if the other cards are Beulah and Mr. C? She's the third person in this trinity.
Oh, God. I should have seen it all along.
Do you get any bad vibes out of Lucy?
Yes.
Actually?
No.
I get bad vibes not out of Lucy, but out of the photograph behind her.
Oh.
So framed there is a photo of Lucy and Andy with their child.
Why do you wait so long to say that?
Because I'm not sure what I'm looking at. There's a photo in the distance behind where she is at her desk.
Yeah.
And we do know that there is a son that they talk about who's named after, like, Marlon Brando, right? We had a sense about that. Or was born on the same day as Marlon Brando. Something like that. And this could be that son, but it looks photoshopped. This child does not look right in this picture. It looks like an adult man's head put onto a child's body.
Well, to be completely fair, I don't believe that the actors actually had a child together to.
You know what you do? You find a normal child.
Nope.
And before you,
that's what they call lying.
Before you accuse me of like calling this like real child ugly, no. If you ever look at this photo, and I'll try to show the professor. Actually, I might do that just in a second. Show him what it looks like up close, like when someone zoomed in on it. This is not a normal photo. Like there is something going on here.
Look at this photograph.
I'm gonna pull it up right now for you, Professor, and share it to you.
Yeah, no, this is
not a normal formal.
This is
family
the
portrait.
Child. Maybe
Something is going on in this photo.
So the proportions are around where like adult facial pieces.
The child's head is the size of the torso.
I feel like the child, like what they did was they took Andy's face, like already like Andy and Lucy's face look already off, especially Andy's face, but they put them together, put them through like one of those like little Snapchat filters to fuse them together. And this is what the child would statistically look like.
It's
with a
really
full
weird
adult's
looking.
head with piercing eyes that is on like the forehead.
Yeah. So like this was a choice that David Lynch made.
The Christmas tree looks nice.
Yeah, sure does. How old does this child look to you? What year of Christmas do you think this was?
It looks like the child's age is XXX9.
So,
as in like 9 years old, but the mysterious like numbers of the future from this alien species pops up as we go into near Mega Man territory.
The child looks like anywhere between ages 4 and 34. I would say somewhere in that range, you know?
It looks like the child wore a mask to Christmas.
So, what is this?
What do you want me to say, Kalil?
Okay. Do you think at this time we're gonna meet the son to compare the childhood photo to what they look
He's
like?
24 now, so I think that he's grown into his body.
So you think we'll see?
I think that he's grown into his body so that the proportion fits.
So do you think like that's the 24-year-old actor's face on there, or do you think that is like the
No,
Photoshop?
I genuinely feel like it's a morphed Photoshop, sort of like they fuse these two parents' faces.
My question is, okay, so is David Lynch doing it to be funny? Or is there a reason why you would do that rather than just get a child actor who just looks kind of like they could be the son? Because, like, it's not hard to find a child who's 4 years old and put a picture on them for a background detail.
Okay. For a background detail, I would say if I was, like, part of this production, it's adding that weird element out into that point of nature that emphasizes the various amounts of weird elements throughout it. Like, having one new weird element added on top of a bunch of other weird elements. Like, it's something that evokes a mood, and that mood is fear at the moment for me. If you want me, if it was my choice, though, if it was my choice, I was David Lynch, this is something just to make people happy. Like, this is like something that if I put this around the actors, like, say, here's your child, I think that, like, that I would do that just to make sure that if I could get them to laugh and just sort of, like, get into, like, a joyful mood, just because this is literally what we're going for.
It's such a bold choice for a background detail. The return is definitely meant to be something you could pause.
Something pause, be serious on, contemplate, look at the details. And then when that's staring right back at you, you wonder if you've gone too far.
Well, because between the frame with Phyllis and this photograph in the background, you kind of need to be aware that, there might be things just lurking moment to moment. So at the police department later, presumably that day, maybe not that day, Deputy Hawk receives a call from Margaret Lannerman, who says her log has a message for him that something is missing. And you have to find it. It has to deal with Dale Cooper. What do you think? Do you have any guesses what's the missing thing that has to deal with Dale Cooper?
Yeah, the Dale Cooper.
Just Dale Cooper himself.
How
on the nose is that? Like, for example, it's like, I need to go to the gas station and get something from my car. It has to do with my car at the gas station. What do I need to go buy?
A car.
A whole new car. Obviously, it's airing my tires anyway, but like, it's so on the nose. So you think it is Cooper himself?
I think that Cooper exists in the world as Mr. C, but Cooper, the Dale Cooper, is something that exists into the lodge. I think that the knowledge of this overall entity makes me still posit that potentially the log has something inside of it.
If I were, again, watching this for the first time and hadn't seen the rest, and I was thinking right now, I would speculate it has to do with one of the two rings. I would think it's either Cooper's ring that he wore, his mother's ring, that disappeared when the giant had those questions for him and then came back later, or even the jade ring that last we heard of had been floating around with like Lana. We haven't really heard what happened to it really much in more recent times.
Yeah, no, I think it's something either metaphysical or something metaphorical.
You're thinking less literal.
Less literal.
See, I'm thinking of a literal ring. Fair enough. Fair enough. But the additional message here from Margaret is that the way you will find it has something to do with your heritage.
Which is strange.
Yeah.
Like,
what does that mean?
It's probably something that has to do with overall history, especially whenever it comes to the people as a whole that overall Hawk is connected to.
Well, you could go with the Nez Perce angle from The Secret History. That would connect it to the ring, but it's more of like how you'll find it, not what it is.
Yeah, so regardless, Hawk just gets a bunch of files and likely is going to look over them over a period of unknown amount of time. But it's something that I didn't expect to pop up. I think you even mentioned something of the angle of like Hawk's heritage would come up in the return. And even then, this feels kind of tacked on.
We'll see what happens. I get where you're coming from, though. I get what you're coming from.
Yeah.
It's like, we have a Native American character. We better do something about that. Like, it does feel like out of left field. But we don't know yet.
We don't know.
And I'll say this. I'll say this now and probably say it again as we continue covering the return. But I am so thankful. So thankful, genuinely.
I am so sorry.
No, genuinely thankful that they were able to get Catherine Coulson her part in The Return, in the sense that she sadly passed away, I think it was in 2015, and her parts had been recorded probably earlier than most other parts, if I had to guess. And so a lot of this so far has been over phone calls, where they had to, have her do her parts. We don't even know if the parts with Hawk were recorded the same year that hers were, right? But you can tell by her appearance and by her voice that she is having health issues of a very serious nature. I don't know if Catherine Coulson is acting much in her line deliveries, nor do I think she needs to, in the sense that they're so emotional already. You can really feel that this is someone who cares deeply about Twin Peaks, and it would have been a real tragedy if she had not been able to be involved. Like, there are so many cast members who died before they could be in The Return, but I think if they would have had to make The Return without Catherine Coulson, that would have been just another hit. Like, it would have been so sad. So, I don't know. Like, her tone just sounds so genuinely distressed.
Literally, there is a point inside of her dialogue later on when, like, Hawk is going off, where she says that she is too weak to follow Hawk, and basically, in her tone of voice, begs Hawk to visit sometime where she has pie as well as coffee for him. Which, personally, I don't take. I think it's mostly inside of the tone and how genuine she's able to put the performance forward, where she's saying that, I have these things for you. I don't feel like it's tacked on to remind you of Twin Peaks as much. I think like it feels very genuine.
It really does. It really does. I mean, it feels like that kind of stereotypical, like, good grandmother who, like, has cookies for you. Like, goes out of their way to bring you cookies.
Yes. Except she can't go out of her way anymore.
She can't, but it's like, while you're here, please stop by. Like, I have these things for you. It feels very genuine. While the second contact is happening between Hawk and Margaret, he is in the woods at night. We talked about that being around Glastonbury Grove. Notably, the music in the background is similar, if not the same track from season 2 when we got to the area of Glastonbury Grove at the finale. It's very similar, eerie, dark ambient. And Hawk, as he's moving the flashlight over Glastonbury Grove, we can see the curtains, the red curtains come in and out. Do you believe Hawk saw those curtains?
Because it's really dependent on, like, if you actually believe those curtains are actually there, or if it's a thematic through line.
Because Windham Earl could go through them.
He could go
and
through
Dale
them.
Cooper could go through them.
Yes.
Truman, to our knowledge, never saw anything, right? I don't think we have any proof that he saw anything other than Cooper just suddenly be there.
Yeah.
I don't know if he saw curtains or not. I'm wondering if by Hawk's expressions, do you think he saw those curtains or not?
If I had to guess, if we're going to be working with themes inside of the overall show, I think it's likely he did see something.
Okay.
Am I certain of it? Am I 100% sure? No. Mostly because of the overall nature of how much is physically real and how much is overall interpretation.
So why do you think, given the themes of this, he would have seen it?
He's someone who's very connected towards things that are spiritual. It's something where, like, Margaret is literally pushing him in a direction, thanks to the overall log, to say, hey, check this out. My log has a message for you. And even Hawk says, like, your log and I are on the same page. It fits very well with the idea of the connection to the mystical that Hawk would have, that he would see something mystical like the curtains or something adjacent to them.
So we have one more character to discuss, but before we do that, the titles or descriptions for these 2 episodes come from the quotes from Margaret.
Yes.
Right? So my question is, given part 1 and part 2, how important do you think these Twin Peaks sections have been in this? Because we spent a lot of time in New York, in Buckhorn, a little bit in Las Vegas, and a lot of time in the red room, black and white room zone. How important do you think the Twin Peaks sections are relative to the screen time?
All of it's set up. Like, the thing is that they're set up everywhere. They're set up absolutely everywhere. But at the very least, I can still say that there's some execution being done on things such as moving the overall, like, body autopsies forward, exploring, like, Mr. C as well as his interactions forward, spending some time with Cooper. I'm not saying that, like, there's not really much of a, I would call, wasted moment, except for potentially that comedy bit that happened over at the apartments. It's something where, like, Twin Peaks didn't need as much focus at this time. Hey, funny when we're talking about literally something called Twin Peaks, I know. But these moments didn't need that much attention at this time. So we have plenty of things being stacked up when they're gonna fall down, when, say for example, we see the strange alien child of Andy and Lucy, when we see what's happening with all the shovels, or if in these scenarios, or whether or not we're going to see anything with the two Trumans, they are just simply there to establish things that could potentially come.
Now, this is where I'll spin the question as well. I feel like for a lot of Twin Peaks, you could tell what was the quote-unquote main plot and what was the quote-unquote side plot. Largely because if it involved Dale Cooper investigating Laura Palmer, it's probably the main plot. If you're looking at Audrey investigating Ben, if you're looking at Donna and James, if you're looking at Nadine, you're looking usually at the B or C plots, you could say. With The Return, do you feel like there is an A plot and B plots?
I think that the A plot that is happening blends in with the B plot to make it feel like an ABBA plot.
Because the Phil Hastings stuff overlaps with Mr. C, which overlaps with Cooper.
It does, but I think that those are like almost like branches from a tree reaching at the overall root and trunk. The two central plots in which everything branches out from in these small little tangents instead of like coming to intertwine with them is the matters with Mr. C as well as Cooper. I think Mr. C more strongly.
Yeah, Mr. C's an active agent.
So if we had to name
he's the protagonist, right?
He's the protagonist, antagonist, however you want to put that. He is most certainly an A-plot individual.
I mean, I think you could say Mr. C's the main character.
Yes.
Which is... let me just ask you. If I said that Mr. C is more the main character in these two parts than Dale Cooper.
Yes. No, absolutely.
I would say yes.
I would agree with that. He could be, whether or not you consider him an antagonist, protagonist, whatever, he still is the most present figure inside of this. In fact... I think it's fitting to have him like on the cover. I think on the DVD I saw the cover of it at one point and looked at it, and it didn't connect to me it was Cooper at the time. I think I made a comment to you. It's like, it's interesting that Hawk's on the cover of this, because I saw the long hair, the overall image. You couldn't tell the skin color because overall it's been grayed out, if you will, into the double line. So I'm like thinking like long-haired individuals, like, that means we might follow someone else, or like this person's gonna become more important. Hawk is becoming more important. That was a correct thing, but for all the wrong reasons. And that's where like the long-haired Coop on the cover is fitting. Mr. C.
I'll say that I do feel that the A plot is the stuff going on most directly with Mr. C and Dale Cooper and the lodges. I think the B plot right now feels like the town of Twin Peaks. I feel like when it cuts to Ben Horn and Jerry, and when it cuts to Jacoby, I'm looking at this like this is the outside stuff right now.
Even then, I'm like, I don't have enough information to be handled on. It feels so outside. It feels more so like a C plot, if anything. Like if you had maybe
it's even further. And that's not to say it's bad. I like a lot of B and C plots that are happening in Twin Peaks. I'm just saying it doesn't feel like it's the main story now. It
doesn't need to be. It centers around Twin Peaks.
I didn't say it needed to be.
I know, I'm emphasizing. I'm emphasizing, not disagreeing.
I'm disagreeing.
It's something that can originate. There can be a lot of through lines that happen with Twin Peaks, especially with the initial points. But I don't think that Twin Peaks needs to be in Twin Peaks for something such as these plots. I think that a lot of things have developed beyond it, that I don't mind going to Buckhorn, and I don't mind going to New York. However, in response to that, these places feel less like places than Twin Peaks. I know we're really early on. I know we're just 2 hours into an experience. But even then, these don't really feel like...
There's not much of a presence.
There's not much of a presence, no.
In any of these locations. And I would even argue the town of Twin Peaks doesn't have much of a presence compared to what it used to have. The town of Twin Peaks, to me, doesn't feel like much of anything.
Yes.
To be honest. And part of it, I think, also is that we get these cuts to these environments like the police station or like the Great Northern, but I don't get a sense of the town. I don't get a sense of the community. We get occasionally a moment with like a waterfall.
We literally get...
But it's not the stoplights. It's not... Yeah.
We get the very populated sheriff's station.
Feels empty.
It's very empty. It's always been empty, though. It's never been populated other than like a few background
Usually
cops.
The music makes it feel like there's more life.
It does. But it's not here. It's no longer here.
I can artistically respect, though, that David Lynch resisted putting nostalgia into it. He didn't cut to the Great Northern and cue Audrey's theme or something. Very carefully avoiding nostalgic needle drops. The most direct song we got, from what I remember, other than the intro itself, The most direct callback to a song is Hawk going to the Glastonbury Grove site where Dale Cooper went into the Red Room using the similar music. But that's not an immediately evocative, positive nostalgia for most people, the way that like a lot of the snappier, jazzier songs are, more upbeat.
Call it semantics, but I still think that by the influence of the director and just out of an outright question of the director, is it more so resisted these things or avoided such urges? In which instead of feeling like that one had to push against a grain, instead it does not consider the grain as is, more so focuses outside the grain, maybe makes references to it, but elsewise lets the water flow over them. And just more so just avoids the overall flow of the water and just like goes whatever path he needs to go rather than pushing against the current.
I don't know David Lynch's heart and soul.
You don't know David Lynch? You haven't talked to DL lately?
I think he had a very decisive idea of what he wanted this to be. Mm-hmm. And if he wanted to pander, he'd pander. This ain't pandering. Say what you want about The Return, and I'll say what I want about The Return. It is not something that is just milking your memories of something for nostalgia and being a weak little shell of itself.
A weak shell of itself in which needs to relentlessly be attacked by hordes of mountain lions, as if like your weak shell was a wildebeest being attacked and torn apart.
So how'd you feel with Sarah Palmer? Because
what the hell?
You and I have both said that we want more Sarah Palmer, that it was wrong in a way.
She's not okay.
What do you mean? She's just watching Animal Planet.
No!
Animal Planet After Dark.
Yeah, that's how it feels.
Animal Planet X-rated.
There's no logo on the screen.
Right.
There is no David Attenborough commentary over the mighty wildebeest being able to be attacked. I don't even know if that's an Attenborough accent. Doesn't matter. There's no commentary. There is no logo. There's nothing to indicate she's watching a show.
Yeah.
She just puts on footage of these wildcats viciously attacking wildebeest.
Look, if you came
as
in
if it's a casual
one day
night
and I was watching that while chain smoking and drinking, would you really think there's something wrong with me?
I would leave. I don't know where I'm going. I just need to get away. I just need to leave.
This is
here for
I think this is
Sarah
honestly
Palmer's.
an incredible inclusion.
Yeah.
And again, I'll say negatives, I'll say positives. It's, of all the ways you could introduce Sarah Palmer back into the narrative, having a short scene with no dialogue where she just smokes, drinks, looks exhausted in this robe.
Like very much like upset. Like also there's like a physicality to her overall face that she like gives like a nasty look to what she's end up seeing on the screen. And that screen,
junk food all over the table. Like it's just a mess, right? It's just not that I'm judging. Everyone's got their own thing, but this feels unkept. Like this feels like someone who is not really taking care of themselves 100%. And that's such an impression to start with, given what she's watching and how she seems like almost to lean into it a bit. We don't know where this is going.
We don't.
But that's such a way to hook interest.
Yeah.
And then it just goes into the song for the Roadhouse. You can even like hear the song start playing in the end of Sarah Palmer's scene.
What's the road? Oh, you mean the Bang Bang Bar.
The Bang Bang Bar.
Oh, yeah, I know the Bang Bang Bar.
So, do you think there's any significance to the scene with Sarah Palmer being right before the bar and it transitioning there, or not?
It's significant for the sake of a stylistic flow and feeling. Not to say that they are coordinated one-to-one, then I think that everyone there is miserable and wanting to watch like little cats fight wildebeest and tear them apart. But I do think that at the very least of the color, the tone, and checking up on the character to make sure that that interest is sort of like peaked, where this show is just almost like gesturing like, yeah, we haven't forgotten, trust me. Like, you saw the other two Palmers, you're probably curious about this Palmer. Here you go. You were wondering likely like how she was like strange of visions, and she could be potentially herself here. It's like almost like setting up a promise to the audience.
It is interesting because, again, it's so disconnected from everything else in the narrative that you could have put this scene with Sarah Palmer literally anywhere else in these two parts, and it wouldn't have really like necessarily mattered.
but it's a dark room with the overall light from the overall TV monitor being the main illuminating factor, which leads into the dark overall outside scope of the Roadhouse, aka Bang Bang Bar, which I think that when it comes to a visual flair and choices from going from scene to scene, they are two that fit very well together.
There's also the themes of isolation versus community in the sense that Sarah Palmer is alone in this house.
Yes.
Cutting to a group of people in a social gathering.
There's a lot of people there. I've never
the Roadhouse
seen so many
never
places.
been this populated before.
And it's all thanks to probably the new ownership of someone who proudly upkeeps the overall lovely Roadhouse. You know him, you love him, because there's no way to really stop looking at this overall individual because it looks very friggin' familiar. It looks like a Renault situation.
According to the credits, the man who is played by the same actor who played Jacques Renault, this actor is now playing a character called Jean-Michel Renault.
How do you feel, Kalil? How do you feel that there's
always
more Renaults under the voice? Even if you know, how do you feel?
I think Secret History had Jean-Jacques Renault, and then obviously between Secret History and Welcome to Twin Peaks Access Guide, we got previous ancestor Renaults. There's just endless Renaults. And some of them are the same person. It's
just the same guy.
And we don't know their relation or how they're connected sometimes. I think it's funny. I did want to say one more thing about Sarah Palmer.
Oh, by all means.
We kind of jumped ahead for that. So Sarah Palmer, I just want to make a comment that it could have been anywhere in the episode. The only area that I think would have really been weird to place the Sarah Palmer scene is if it would have been right next to either before or after the scene in part 1 where Sam and Tracy are eviscerated, because that would be almost so on the nose, right? Looking into the glass box and finding the violence and the tearing and the shredding, and then cutting to or from Sam and Tracy being
You
attacked.
gotta pace out your eviscerations. Yes, I do.
But the reason
agree.
I bring that up is because part of me does wonder if that's a connection that was anyway intended. The idea of the predator tearing apart the prey with what we saw with Sam and Tracy. Considering the potential of reading the glass box as being a TV. You see where I'm coming from. It's not enough really here to say for sure, but it's enough to give a little bit of a theory, right? A little bit of a nod, right?
A little bit of potential nod in theory, sure. Or
if glass box is TV, then...
And meanwhile,
at the Roadhouse and Bang Bang Bar, we get Shelly there, who is talking with a table of friends we may not recognize, talking about her daughter Becky being with the wrong guy, someone named Steven. Now, when we were watching this, I did point out that this was the actor who played Shelly.
yes.
And in the future, we kind of agreed that I'm going to not point out those kinds of things until the podcast.
Yes.
So, do you think you would have recognized Shelly over time, or do you think you wouldn't have noticed it was her?
Probably with more dialogue. There's only so little dialogue that we get right here. It's just someone who is recounting that James was always cool. Like, you can recognize somewhat of the overall tone, but there's so many distracting elements inside the bar, and also trying to like focus on like so many like new people inside this life. It's something that completely like was overshot. It's something where like she's getting a vibe. She's overall getting some good company as someone overall off in the distance ends up entering the overall building itself and is looking around and just like enjoying the vibes, but still looking at the table from afar. And there's a point where the music picks up, especially with the keyboards, like da 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 da, where I paused the overall show. I was like, man, this guy has just such a like a dumb look on his face. Is like just moronically looking like this lovey-dovey. He's like, oh, that's James.
Yeah, you figured James out. That's for sure.
The thing is, it's the way that I ended up sort of like making the connections. Just like this dumb look on James's face.
I will say,
like
it's been contextualized differently.
It has.
In the sense that James enters the bar and Shelly's friends say there's something wrong with that guy. And Shelly defends him.
Yes.
And explains that he did get into a motorcycle accident. And he's been quiet ever since. Like, that's what's going on, is that it was caused by an accident. So maybe you kind of saw it as the dumb James expression that we saw him awkwardly have in the past.
Yeah.
But I would say there's a change in James. That as he interacts, even though it's a little bit, we don't get a lot, he does seem to be more out of his element and a little more awkward in a way that I think is sympathetic.
No, absolutely. If I can say one thing about this performance, especially when it comes to wandering into this bar, the overall looks, acknowledgments, and just, or like vibing inside of this overall environment, so far out of all the James performances, this is my favorite one. I think genuinely he blends well into it. I think that he looking overall lost, as well as having the conflicts of outer characters work into that overall expression. I think James is very fitting for this part, and I'm very, very excited to see more of James.
Are you excited to see the person that James entered the bar with?
The gloved man?
The gloved man.
The green gloved man.
Look, I'm not going to say whether this character shows up again or not, but I just think it's funny that James enters the bar with some random guy who, if you look at like his voice, is like a British accent and has like...
If you look at his voice.
Look at his voice. Well, the subtitles do give an indication based on his slang.
It's British
I think
font.
he used bullocks at one point. It's like, that's not American. And... So, yeah, British guy with a one green glove on his hand, which you compared to the Hulk glove. So,
it is shrunken Hulk glove. He had it since he was a child, but the thing is, the plastic wore down and melted into his skin for one reason or another.
Are you excited for the ongoing story of Fire Walk with Hulk?
Yes.
Okay.
How could you say no to that?
How could you say no? I want to point out with Shelly also that, she talked about her daughter. Are we assuming that Becky is the daughter of Shelly and Bobby? Because it didn't seem like Shelly was pregnant with Leo's child.
It's hard to say, because there is a character off in the distance with very cool hairs, like certainly like shaped eyebrows.
Certainly those eyebrows are shaped.
And a overall taste in clothing that gives a wink at Shelly, looks off into the distance. That seems potentially Bobby adjacent. That I find very intriguing, especially since how like the show ended with Shelly and Bobby. So, very curious on where that is at. Elsewise, this overall relationship with the person across the area from the bar makes me very curious on what happened with Bobby, to say the least.
Now, this actor is Balthazar Getty, is the name of the actor. And I don't know if you caught in the credits your second viewing, we do get a name for this character at the bar.
It's Bobby.
It is Red.
It's Bobby.
The name is Red.
It's Bobby.
It's just the word Red.
Are you
going to acknowledge that the character's name is Red?
I'm going to put like a nice little note card right next to the overall name. It scrolls up with the credits. It just says Bobby.
I feel like any other situation, you'd be commenting on how weird it is this man's name is a color.
It's so it's Robert. Maybe his middle name's Edgar, and Briggs was just so weird of saying that my name is Reb that they just went to the next curly letter.
They just flipped the B around? Okay.
No.
The character's name is Red.
Red is curious, to say the least.
Okay.
Design-wise, like, at the very least, design-wise isn't like human design-wise.
Sure.
Looks very Bobby to me, but Red's curious at the very least.
They have a daughter named Becky, or maybe either Red does or Bobby does or some other person.
Yes.
And there's this worry that she's going with the wrong guy. We've talked before about Twin Peaks Echoes of Generations. The potentiality here that Becky could be reliving the situation of Shelly, right? Depending on what the story is. We don't know who this guy is. We don't know Steven's situation. But the idea of she's seeing the wrong guy, Shelly would know a thing or two about that. Either that, or Bobby could have turned out to be the wrong guy. In 25 years, for all we know, he's a piece of garbage. We don't know yet.
Yeah.
We haven't seen Bobby. We've only seen Red.
Good old Red and or Bobby.
Also, another piece of evidence, I would say that David Lynch is toying with the audience, and I think he knows, with a capital K, he knows, is that when Shelly gives the line, James is still cool, James has always been cool, it's such a close-up on her that isn't there for like the other dialogue she has. It's like such an in-your-face line that I feel like David Lynch is like, I know you didn't quite care for James Marshall. You thought he was a bit awkward and not cool. Well, I'm here to tell you that James is cool. In fact, James has always been cool. That's what I feel like is happening to us.
Thank you, David Lynch. Could you please sit down now? I'm trying to watch the movie.
So, are you convinced that James has always been cool?
No!
Why not? You seemed to talk positively about Donna last time we talked about her in another pod episode. Has James similarly warmed up to you over the time?
James, on paper, as someone that I find very interesting.
He's on a motorcycle,
James,
not on paper.
On paper, I think has very great dynamics, especially whenever it comes to the other Hurleys. And James on paper, with the idea of the Hurley curse and the fact that there's even a motor accident, wherever that motor accident exists is a very big curiosity to me, because that can change the dynamics of, say, for example, James's journey if he ever got a chance to take it, because it seemed like he needed it. He really needed it. If it happens so soon afterwards, that would break a person. In any case, James as a person on paper, I find very interesting. When it comes down to any of the interactions, this person who, like, during the pilot, like, hunches his overall shoulders and penguin waddles up to you in the locker is like, hey, how's it going, buddy?
You're saying you don't like that?
It's a familial cool.
Yeah.
It's a familial cool. It's not something that's going to be slick back my hair. It's like, hey, baby. It's like Johnny Bravo style, the coolest person known to man.
Yeah, the universally acknowledged cool guy.
It's something that's familial cool, I think. It's something where, like, this is the friendly person in the hallway that is quite quirky, but overall is cool in the overall steps that he takes. But if you take him on any other level than that, he's the guy off in the corner that's making, like, weird sounds, gesture, punches a wall, and then goes off on his motorcycle.
I don't think James is cool. I do think he's a bit tragic, even before we got to this accident idea.
Yeah.
And we talked before about how when we look at the pilot, we kind of realized that Donna had more of a support group than James ever did.
Yeah.
Not only did Donna have more supportive parents, even though there was obviously some distance, but still more supportive.
Yeah.
And she had friends at school. James, meanwhile, had Ed, who I think also emotionally was pretty stunted, and Nadine, who half the time forgot he even was there. So it seems like James didn't really have anyone except Donna and then Maddie, and then Maddie dies. And if James learned that Leland was the killer, how completely terrible James might feel because he wasn't able to do anything. James could never have saved Laura. He never was able to help Laura. And given the way Laura kind of treated him toward the end, she even flat out called him dumb, like, to his face. And it feels like James got such a bad deal that then you add on the motorcycle accident that my headcanon at this point would be that, yes, I believe that an accident at some point probably happened, whether 25 years ago, 15 years ago, or 5 years ago, who knows? But is that the thing that broke James internally and really hurt him? Or was it everything else he had been burying and dealing with for years of his life, especially the year of 1990 or whenever Laura Palmer died, 89? I think it's more likely that it was the straw that broke the camel's back situation, that I would assume that James was already in such a vulnerable spot, even after the Evelyn arc, that motorcycle accident just pushed him into the other direction. That he already had enough going on that I would imagine there's almost more psychological than physical here.
No.
And again, I think it's sympathetic. I think even though James made a lot of dumb decisions, he was a teenager. And I do think that in the grand scope of things, he had so little there to support him that I understand why he'd run away. But then imagine when you run away, you further get hurt. Yeah, I think it could really snap someone. So we'll see what happens there, or maybe we won't. Maybe that's the last time James ever shows up in the return.
For the last time. For the last time.
So, Shadows by the Chromatics. I'm going to go through some of the lyrics with you, and I want you to give some interpretations or thoughts you have on them, and I'll share some if I got some too.
Are you going to say all the lyrics, or are you trying to go verse by verse?
I'm going to go verse by verse, but not say the repeatings, because most of the song is repetition.
Okay.
There's actually not that many words in the song.
I have one major thought, but I'm more than glad to attempt to riff off.
And then tie into that thought if you need.
Very well.
Or so desire. So the first part of the song, Shadow, take me down with you for the last time.
Yeah, I'm literally going to just throw it out there. Shadow,
Cool.
take me down for the last with you. This is at the start of the show. I do consider part 1 and part 2 to be the quote-unquote beginning, if you will. I think that it's hard to separate them. I think it's a great way to start it. And so, by starting off saying, Shadow, take me down with you. Shadow. Doppelganger. We have a conflict with the Cooper.
So you think this is the idea that the doppelganger is going to take Cooper down with him?
I think either way, Cooper take down the doppelganger take down the Cooper, the Shadow will be taken down with the person.
And for the last time would indicate finality.
Finale. I do genuinely believe this will be the end of Special Agent Dale Cooper as well as Mr. C.
Okay.
In some form and capacity.
Place your
bets
now.
It's something that I think is such a nice overall song to put forward, especially shortly after the finding of the body. I genuinely do think that it's just setting up for that conclusion while we are like slowly heading towards that overall inevitability.
Now, I do want to preface that David Lynch did not write these song lyrics, and I don't know if there's anything out there that would confirm whether or not David Lynch chose this song. He probably chose the artist, but did he specifically choose this song for its lyrics? I don't know. Maybe.
The overall people onto the overall stage are not usually overlapping with the characters that are on the floor. So, from what I understand, you did make a comment that stated that the credits have a theme, if you will.
Yeah, that they said that the episode or part 1 credits going to the black and white gramophone sounds is not normal. There's a different format that happens.
Yes, the different format. What I'm imagining, and I will find out with the next episode,
Sure.
what I'm imagining is that there's a live performance going off on the stage over at the Bang Bang Bar,
Okay.
in which under the blue light there are people that are playing music, if you will. And that music, I imagine, won't be the same. Like, I'm personally imagining it's not going to be the same. So having a overall sound being done on the stage, if there was ever a song to swap in, again, I don't think the characters
You're saying which episode it got slotted with.
Exactly.
Seems important.
Yes.
Okay,
So
I'm willing to go with that.
So even like if multiple people play onto the stage multiple times, as long as there's no character heads overlapping with the overall
Sure.
people onto the stage, they could
You
slot
could
into where it's
splice in
best
anything.
in. Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I get what you're coming from there. Next part is you're in the water. I'm standing on the shore, still thinking that I hear your voice. Can you hear me?
Literally, Cooper gets flung into a pool of water.
I would counter potentiality of Laura Palmer in the sense that she had her body wash up in the water on the shore. She has been a shadow looming over the town and over the series.
Very
An
well.
alternate interpretation, but I do get what you're saying. The water is very potentially literal.
And the fact that literally, if we are to say on one's mind with Mr. C, I can only imagine that Cooper is potentially on Mr. C's mind with what's bound to happen soon.
This one reminds me of James a bit, the next part. At night, I'm driving in your car, pretending that we'll leave this town. We're watching all the streetlights fade.
No, that does fit very well with James. I do know that we've already seen like a vehicle with Mr. C driving away to say that overall with those overall late nights, thoughts would be the same. But for like James, I think that's also thematic. If we want to branch this out to other characters and like how this branches out probably to other elements of Twin Peaks, I imagine that that can be a case. I'm still just playing the Mr. C camp here.
That's fair. And now you're just a stranger's dream. I took your picture from the frame, and now you're nothing like you seem.
We live inside a dream.
So this one to me, I think of the frame, I think of Laura Palmer's photograph. It's the most famous framed photograph. Whether you're thinking of the one that's in the school or the one that Leland took and then bled over.
The more that we discover about Laura Palmer as a person, the more that we discover the flaws, the more with the interactions, as well as how people interpret her afterwards, as well as all this time that passes through, and how we keep seeing even the frames at the beginning of what it seems to be these episodes. It's lost almost all meaning.
Can I big brain it for a moment?
Big brain.
So I think that a picture is very similar to a memory. It's a snapshot, right? It's a moment in time. And if you think about taking the picture from the frame to take it out from where it normally is, you're taking the memory of Twin Peaks, potentially, and you're re-examining it and noticing that something is wrong here. Something doesn't feel like it used to.
Yeah.
It's when you recall something and time has passed. 25 years, for example. I think there's a meta reading you could do here.
Very well.
Not just on Dale Cooper or Laura, but on the entirety of the show right now. And then your shadow fell like last night's rain for the last time.
Time to fall, baby.
Time to fall.
Time to die.
So, again, you've told me off pod, you read it as most likely a bad ending for Dale Cooper, although not necessarily a bad ending for the town of Twin Peaks.
Correct.
Okay.
It might be. I'm willing to be wrong, but that's just because, for the most part,
You're willing to be... I like your wording of I'm willing to be wrong.
I'm
Whereas
willing
if
to be
you
wrong.
weren't willing to be wrong, you would just fight.
some people aren't. Some
That's
people aren't. Some
very
people will
true.
defend like an idea to the end. I'm willing to be wrong, especially since we don't have much of a town of Twin Peaks yet. We don't. Like in the return, in the context of the return, we don't have much of a town of Twin Peaks. We have a few venues that we've stopped by along the way, but there's not much that has been really explored for me to say that there's doom and gloom for absolutely everybody. Who knows? Maybe Sarah Palmer is just right around the corner from jumping up from the couch and saying, you know what? I'm not going to pick up these horrifying videos from the shady man in the alley. I'm going to stop smoking and I'm going to find some people to give me good company because I don't deserve to be alone like this.
Professor.
Someone help Sarah Palmer.
Professor.
Someone help Sarah Palmer.
Do you hear the sounds? Do you hear the sounds, Professor? It sounds to me like it's...
Do you say the whooshing first, or do I press the button?
It's the whooshing counter. The whooshing counter, the new section of our podcast.
I love the fact that their wishing counter already has like a broken button that adds electricity to the end. I love the fact that like this is the way that we're introducing it because the sound bite wouldn't appropriately work.
So, for listeners who use the subtitles, you may have noticed that the word whoosh appears many times, and I'm going to keep track of it as we go. No one's asking me to do this,
Kalil?
but I'm doing it anyway.
Kalil, you...
Math is not my
Why?
strongest subject, so I might get this wrong.
Why?
Okay, so part 1, to my count, had 11 whooshes. Part 2 had 18 whooshes. For a total, after the 2-part opener,
For 2 hours.
29 whooshes.
So there's 29 which... Okay.
10 of those whooshes in part 1 were from the experiment appearing. It was 10 whooshes in just that scene, if I counted right. Because any time that the word whoosh appeared, I counted that, even if it just says whooshing. Whooshing continues. That second whooshing continues is a new whoosh.
Kalil, is everything okay?
Everything's whoosh. Okay? Everything is so whoosh right now, okay? My favorite subtitle with whooshing was when Laura takes off her face, it says intense ethereal whooshing. I like that one. And then my second honorable mention favorite whoosh is that just the New York City traffic, it says distant traffic whooshing. The sounds that cars make in New York City. Whoosh. I find joy out of this.
All right, we have a quantity, an abundance of whoosh, in which there's a lack of further onomatopoeia.
So if you want,
it happens in such abundance.
If you want to make a game out of it, listener, you at home can predict how many whooshes are going to be in the next episode and see how right you were.
Or you can literally follow along with Kalil's crazy train and just see for yourself by turning on subtitles on the return. Apparently, there's a lot of whooshes.
Now we're going to whoosh on over to this week's wonderful and strange questions of the week. Now, in the original airing of the show, it would usually be who killed Laura Palmer. We don't have an obvious question like that.
Who killed Laura Palmer? I'm gonna guess Mr. C.
So, until we get a new obvious question, if we ever do, I'm just gonna throw some new ones at you now and then.
Who killed mysterious body limb man?
So my first question for you, and I don't know the best way to word this, but I have encountered people online saying that their first Twin Peaks experience was The Return. They had never seen the original show or any of those stuff before. My question for you is, if someone had never watched the original Twin Peaks or seen any David Lynch film, how do you think this experience would play out for them?
This experience with the 2-hour adventure,
Yes.
it would be something strange and abnormal that is being presented onto television that I would argue has not been seen very commonly.
Do you think it makes sense without the original show?
I think it makes sense without the original show. I think it's enhanced with the overall original show. But genuinely, like, for one, I think that the appeal of this that I can already see would be the same appeal that we've heard time and time again on like how Twin Peaks on TV wasn't like anything else with its overall techniques. This is shot very much like a David Lynch movie. Like the movie techniques that David Lynch has incorporated have not left for this overall limited series event TV 18-part movie, however you want to put it. This episodic format of a show that you would see on Showtime on a weekly format feels unique thanks to the overall style of usage of movie technique. And I think that overall, the mysteries and what's overall is kept vague from the audience, I think the return does well enough with returning some elements to give at least enough context where you can follow along on the stranger elements while it's not being bogged down by the details of how much there is in the history of, say, for example, Twin Peaks in the past. I think it does well enough for that job. I think that still there's areas in which like things aren't as compelling, such as the characters.
I mean, it does show you the scenes of Dale Cooper with the doppelganger, so you know what the doppelganger is, and it does show you Laura in the past.
Yes.
So you do get those flashbacks.
You do get those flashbacks, but even with like those flashbacks, those little pieces, Again, that's what's reminding me without being bogged down. With the characters that are being incorporated, I don't think that they need to necessarily be the most compelling, if you will. I think that it succeeds where it is in the narrative. And I do think that there's a general feel from this overall show that can bring in people to experience Twin Peaks for the first time as opposed to the last time.
For the last time.
That I don't know how the reverse would be, if you will, if you do your sequel podcast and you bring in someone and start off with the return and then go back into everything else.
Is it a better or worse starting point than Fire Walk With Me?
Better.
Better? I'm inclined to agree with you right now.
Yeah, no, I think that with the weight of Laura Palmer as a character, seeing everything that sort of like happens with Laura Palmer and also reading into the book, there's so much that is enhanced by those experiences. I can't think of additional material other than like the original Twin Peaks that would enhance this experience. But then again,
we've gone through everything.
We've gone through
everything.
literally everything, and I think it enhances my experience personally. But for, say, for example, a vast majority of audiences where, say, for example, if I've told them as far as, like, you have to watch all the episodes before you can even touch it, no, I won't. If I think someone can vibe with the overall drama and emotion from the return, I'm not afraid to show them the return.
Sure.
I might give someone who's going into Fire Walk With Me, maybe not a rundown of the show, but at the very least Secret Diary of Laura Palmer.
I think there's a case to be made of showing them at least the pilot of the original show.
At least the pilot, and
either the original or the international, I guess.
I think that there's a case for that, yes.
And then that would give them enough of an idea of what Twin Peaks was like, and who Dale Cooper was, and who Truman was, and all this sort of stuff, that honestly, just off of the first episode, you might do a lot better than if you hadn't showed them anything in the original show. I think that might be the most important thing to show. I don't know. Maybe even the last episode. I don't know. Would the pilot or the last episode be a better primer if someone wanted to watch just one thing before the return? That's kind of tricky.
That's really tricky because genuinely, I don't think that the final episode stands up on its own. I think it's amazing for what it does as a conclusion.
Yeah.
But if you just give someone the final chapter of a book,
I would say the pilot's the more important thing.
Pilot is the more important thing.
And I would almost say this is the one instance where I would almost pick the international. If I was able to talk to the person when I'm showing it to them and be like, hey, this ending is weird, but the international would give them the red room. That's kind of where like I'm leaning is like they would see Bob, they would know what Bob is and get the red room. I might be willing to say watch the international version and then jump into the return.
It's a compelling argument, but I think that the international pilot most certainly works better than the final chapter of Twin Peaks to introduce them to this wildness.
So, second question for Wonderful and Strange Question of the Week is related to this, is if we think of part 1 and part 2 of the return as the pilot for the return, is it a better pilot than the original pilot of Twin Peaks?
This is a different flavor of ice cream entirely. For me, it's something where
it's not ice cream, it is a movie TV show. You are watching like an hour and a half to 2 hours of televised programming.
The tones are so notable in these cases, where the big questions are not which one succeeds as their independent items, but rather what succeeds in the mission statement this is giving. A pilot, as opposed towards an individual movie or an individual episode, is something meant to compel people to continue, watch, engage, and dive deep into it. This pilot here, if we count the first and second episodes, is something that needs to engross you with the mystery and the mythical elements that make you want to overall continue to pick up the pieces. Meanwhile, the singular big mystery with the overall quirky characters and the strangeness of the pilot for Twin Peaks accomplishes its goal with more aloofness. If you take the first part of the return without the second part, I would say most certainly like Twin Peaks, like the original, wins out just because there's so much dead space that I can see someone putting it down if they were only given part 1 of the return.
But if you do both,
I think that that's where a lot of the strength and the payoff comes in for the return, where I would be compelled to say the return in this aspect, because I do think that there's a lot more what I would call enriching to my own perspective now than what seems to be the more not happy-go-lucky, but very fictionalized feel that Twin Peaks, the original, kind of plays into. The one singular mystery, the strange loner who ends up wandering into the place, as opposed towards a completely series of broken people likely trying to find forms of recovery or persistence in trying to keep their lives intact. Like, I find it, and maybe that's just because I'm in a honeymoon phase with The Return right now, but I do think that there's a lot of like compelling story beats that are being lightly brushed on that I can't wait to see the expansion on in The Return, hence why I think it's stronger for me in this moment.
It is certainly very exciting stuff. It's very exciting. Listener, if you are following along with us, either first time watching or rewatching The Return, we are going to decide as we go if we're going to do part 3 and 4 together or just do part 3 for next time. If you are trying to just follow along with us and you want to be extra safe, I'd recommend checking out 3 and 4 because we don't know what we're going to give you.
But in case you are watching with us in a live format, you want to make sure that you are nice and safe and you don't want to look too far and you're just trying to make sure that you're working with the good old Professor and Kalil on their journey beat by beat. Well, thank you, personally. I'm really glad to have you on this road trip with us. But we'll try to send out a tweet once we know if we're going to be covering out the 3rd and 4th part. So again, follow us at Snake Eye Dreams on the Twitter. Don't email us. We won't. I don't know if Kalil will respond if you say, hey, what are you doing?
I'll respond.
You'll respond? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Kalil will
I'll
respond to you
individually
as Snake Eye
respond
Dreams one.
Yeah, also
the
also tell
one.
you a joke.
Oh, there's a promise here. There's
Yeah.
a transaction here.
Yeah.
If you want to see the joke that Kalil gives us, just send whatever you want as a message
And you
to
know
Snake
I
Eye
have an
Dreams.
excellent sense of humor, right?
Brilliant.
You know I have a good... You know, you're supposed to say yes. I'm funny, right?
I believe in you.